The case of Joe Arridy is perhaps the most flagrant violation of rights in the history of American capital punishment and ranks among the saddest chapters in the annals of the U.S. criminal justice system. Beyond its obvious themes about the trampling of rights of the accused and the Wild West way of conducting law, the story of Joe Arridy is so much more. From the treatment of the mentally handicapped to the abuse of the fundamental rights that all Americans take for granted today, the Arridy case is almost like a harbinger of what was to come. Supreme Court cases like Miranda and Atkins would have saved Joe Arridy today from the wrongful prosecution he faced back then. But unfortunately for him, those decisions would come a few decades too late. Joe Arridy's story begins not at the turn of the 20th century when he was born, but actually in the early 90s. Robert Persky, a lifelong advocate and attorney who fought for the rights of the mentally disabled in prison, received a letter from a close friend and sociologist one day describing the contents of a disturbing poem. The poem, titled The Clinic by Marguerite Young, told how a prison warden wept bitterly as a death row inmate was consumed with playing with a toy train just moments before his execution, completely oblivious that the end was near. Intrigued and appalled by the subject of the poem, Persky made it his mission to validate if the prisoner in the poem was a real-life person or not. Over the course of several years, Persky made trips through the Rocky Mountain states of Colorado and Wyoming, searching archives and libraries far and wide to see if the mystery prisoner, in fact, lived. The result of that investigation proved not only that the inmate in the poem turned out to be Joe Arridy, but that his story was even more tragic than that poem could ever put into words. Arridy entered this world in April 1915 when he was born to two recent immigrants from Syria, then known as the Ottoman Empire. His parents had escaped their home country for a better life in the United States. His father brought his wife to the city of Pueblo, Colorado, to find a job at one of the area's many steel mills. It was here that his mother gave birth to their son. However, even from an early age, it was pretty apparent that Arridy was different from other children his age. Though he did not speak English, he spoke little in his parents' native tongue. During those early years, Arridy was known to keep to himself and not bother anyone, no matter how hard people tried to communicate with him. His parents did send him to elementary school when he was about 4 years old, but that did not end well for him. After just a year in school, the principal approached his father and said that Joe was just incapable of learning. From that point forward, Joe would stay home and never go to school again. For the next several years, Joe pretty much kept to himself. As his mother reported, he often enjoyed long walks around the neighborhood, murmuring to himself along the way. Joe also liked to hammer nails into wood or make mud pies when not out for a walk. All these things he did alone. Joe continued his solitary lifestyle for 4 years until his father lost his job. Probably due to stress from having to watch over his son at home, his parents decided to have him committed to a sanitarium. With support in the form of written affidavits from their neighbors, Joe's parents successfully applied to have Joe become a ward of the state. Back then, sanitariums were places where people with severe mental and physical disabilities were left in the state's care. Because back then, the general attitude was that people with these kinds of disabilities needed to be kept away from society at large. These institutions were often horrible. However, there's no mention that Joe suffered abuse at the Colorado State Home and Training School for Mental Defectives in Grand Junction. During his first stay, the court wanted to see just how severe Joe's disabilities actually were. The doctors and psychologists there subjected him to many tests. Not surprisingly, he did not perform well on them. During the numbers portion of the test, he could not say half of the first 10 numbers. He also did not understand the concept of colors. When presented with the color red, he said it was black. He performed equally poor for other colors. The examinations also consisted of a series of free response questions. Doctors found that, though Joe could answer in simple yes or no responses, any questions that involved more than that he was incapable of comprehending. When asked what the difference between stone and glass was, what the days of the week were, or the difference between a fly and a butterfly, he had no response. Joe would just sit in silence and stare blankly at his doctor. Once all the testing was completed, the medical team found that he had an IQ of just 46 and was severely mentally disabled. Despite these findings, after just a short 9 months there, Joe's father sorely missed him and asked that he be returned to their care. The state obliged, and for the next several years, Joe continued his usual routine that he had done during his developmental years. However, his unsupervised walks around the neighborhood and his time at home would end at the tender age of 14 when a local probation officer caught a gang of teenagers raping Joe. Nothing is known if anything happened to Joe's attackers, but what is known for sure is what happened to Arridy after this incident. The probation officer was furious that such a clearly disabled person could be allowed to roam free in the community, and it was clear to him that his parents did not care to supervise or care for him. Though this was the first time his attackers had been caught red-handed, it was a local rumor that attacks like this happened frequently. The probation officer arrested Joe for his own safety, and then he petitioned the court to have Joe recommitted back to the facility he was in when he was 10 years old. In his petition, the probation officer stated that Joe was the most severe case of mental retardation he had ever encountered. The court agreed and had him committed back to the same home he had been at before. While staying at the home for a second time, the staff there found that Joe could not comprehend most of what they told him. Due to his disability, he could not perform manual labor even though he physically could have done so. He also had no mental capacity to attend class or learn anything taught at the schoolhouse on the grounds. Instead, the staff assigned Joe to work in the kitchen. Mrs. Bowers was the worker assigned to watch over Joe all day, and she would later describe just how limited his cognitive function really was. Mrs. Bowers described Joe as only having enough understanding to complete short and simple tasks. Washing the dishes, mopping the floor, and doing other small chores were all he could do. While the staff might have thought that this would be Joe's life for the remainder of his time on Earth, Joe had other plans. Close to the home, there were a set of train tracks. Joe and some of his friends often watched men hitchhiking by riding the boxcars. It's unknown why exactly Joe left, since there's been no evidence of abuse or abandonment at the home. But no matter why, after 7 years, Joe and a group of men would leave for good. After a few trial runs where Joe and another kitchen worker would leave and come back after a day, Joe and 3 other patients decided to leave the institution permanently. The men walked away from the institution and hopped on a train headed to Pueblo. The next day, they rode a train back to Grand Junction. Joe's last known sighting was August 13th, when the other patients he was with said that after arriving back in Grand Junction, he had wandered off by himself. For the next week, Arridy's whereabouts were unknown. He became separated from his group of patients and walked barefoot and hungry into the camp kitchen of a railroad work crew on the morning of August 20th in Cheyenne, Wyoming. The kitchen staff took pity on him, and they gave him new clothes along with free food. In return, Joe had to wash the dishes for them. After 6 days of this arrangement, the crew had to move on to another work site even further from Cheyenne, and Joe could not go with them since he was not a paid employee. One of the workers took pity on him and drove him to the nearest rail yard where he could hop on another train. However, Joe would never make it on another train since later that same day, he was arrested for vagrancy by railroad detectives who turned him over to the Cheyenne Police Department. Unbeknownst to Arridy, when he left Grand Junction on August 13th and arrived at the work camp in Cheyenne on the 20th, someone had committed a horrible murder in Pueblo, Colorado. During the night of Saturday, August 15th, 1936, an intruder broke into the home of the Drain family. The Drain sisters, Dorothy and Barbara, were asleep in their bed when the intruder broke into their room. The man began beating both the girls with a blunt object. After the assault, the man raped Dorothy, the 15-year-old sister, while Barbara, the 12-year-old sister, was left for dead. Miraculously, she survived her attack and was taken to the hospital, where she told police what had happened. As soon as Barbara gave her statement, police all over Colorado and surrounding states began looking for suspects. The police in Cheyenne, Wyoming were also doing their part to aid in the manhunt. Sheriff George Carroll was personally interviewing all recently arrested suspects to see if they had any connection to the assault on the Drain sisters. During his first night in custody at the Laramie County Jail, Sheriff Carroll decided to interview him. When Sheriff Carroll discovered Arridy had traveled through Pueblo on his way to Cheyenne, he immediately became a person of interest. What happened next on that fateful August night is lost to history. Only Sheriff Carroll truly knows what transpired. According to Sheriff Carroll, after just 90 minutes of questioning, Arridy made a full confession to the rape and murder of Dorothy and the brutal beating of Barbara. According to Carroll, Joe claimed that he did it. Joe also said that he had committed the crime with a club. After this whirlwind confession, Sheriff Carroll contacted the Pueblo Police Department to inform them that he had the murderer in custody. However, this was a complete surprise to the Pueblo police, since they too had another suspect in custody for the murder. According to the Pueblo Police Department, a man named Frank Aguilar was the prime suspect. Frank Aguilar was a day laborer from Mexico, whom the Drain sisters' father had supervised for various work projects. Barbara had identified him as the attacker, and when police searched his home, they found an axe head with markings consistent with the attack. Though Frank adamantly denied anything to do with the assault and murder, he did say that he had never heard or seen of a Joe Arridy in his life when questioned. Despite his statement, the Pueblo Police Chief Arthur Brady thought it appropriate to have Arridy extradited to Pueblo to face justice for his role in the crime, but wanted some of his own men to interview Joe in Cheyenne. Despite what Arridy did or did not say, he was the most hated man west of the Mississippi River by the morning. Shortly after calling Chief Brady, Sheriff Carroll called a local reporter about the purported confession. Soon, newspapers across Colorado, Wyoming, and surrounding states contained the details about the crime and confession. All eyes were on Arridy at this point. Chief Brady's men arrived in Cheyenne the following day. Arridy's confession continued from the previous evening. Sheriff Carroll said Joe changed his story 5 times, but finally told the truth. One of the details that changed was the weapon Joe allegedly used in the attack. During his first interrogation with Sheriff Carroll, he said he'd used a club. Now the sheriff was saying he confessed to using a hatchet. However, this detail had only been known by the Pueblo police detectives who had already arrested Frank Aguilar and recovered the hatchet head. During the morning confession, Joe made the first and only connection to Frank Aguilar. Though Joe at first claimed he was the only assailant, after the arrival of the Pueblo detectives, whenever he was asked who he did it with, he said, "with Frank." Of course, in hindsight, through a modern lens, this confession is clearly preposterous. Joe simply did not have the mental capacity to form plans, much less a homicide. He also could only speak in up to 2-word phrases at a time. Such phrases like, "with Frank," fit perfectly with the fact that the police were spoon-feeding Joe the information needed to form the link to Frank Aguilar. This is because, since Aguilar at the time was not talking, this way they could get a confession that linked him to the physical evidence recovered from his home. Once Joe had confessed, Chief Grady had his men bring him back to Pueblo. The following day, on August 28th, Chief Grady had Arridy reenact the crime at the Drain household. After this, they took him back to the police station, where a local pawn shop owner came into the station to make a statement after seeing his photo in the newspaper. Saul Kahn, the pawn shop owner, said he had sold Arridy a pistol Friday, August 14th, the day before the homicide. However, Kahn never produced any proof that he had, in fact, even sold a firearm, much less one to Joe Arridy. But even if he did, Arridy was not allowed to have money at the institution, and it's unclear how Joe could have gotten any money to begin with, since he had never held down a job. Adding further confusion to the mix was the police bringing in Frank Aguilar to be identified by Arridy. When Joe saw Aguilar, he said, "That's Frank," but Aguilar once again stated that he had never seen that man before. After this, a woman named Helen O'Driscoll, who was similarly attacked at home on August 23rd, came in to identify Arridy as her attacker. However, it soon became apparent that her testimony was inaccurate, since on August 23rd, Joe had been surrounded all day and night by witnesses at the railroad work camp in Cheyenne. Though Arridy would not be charged in connection with the assault on O'Driscoll, this was a harbinger of what was to come. After weeks and months of investigation, police began to piece together a series of related attacks and homicides that would ultimately fall upon Aguilar's shoulders. But for the time being, the police were focused on solving the most high profile of this recent string of attacks, the murder of Dorothy Drain. Though the Cheyenne police had apparently extracted a confession from Arridy, the Pueblo Police Department still wanted to get an admission on their own. For 5 days, Pueblo detectives questioned Aguilar day and night about the murder of Dorothy Drane. It was not until the morning of September 2, 1936, that Aguilar allegedly confessed after hours of interrogation that day. In an officer-prepared and typed statement, Pueblo detectives documented the confession that Aguilar made. Though Arridy was also in the room, detectives only asked him a handful of questions. In the confession, detectives asked Aguilar pointed questions like if he had known Arridy and what role Arridy took in the attack. Interestingly enough, whenever questions about Arridy's involvement in the crime arose, Aguilar answered for him. Such a fact is known since Arridy answered just 6 questions during the hours-long interview, and none of his questions were materially related to the crime. Another troubling fact was the prosecutor's statement after the confession was inked. He claimed that Arridy was an active and willing participant during the confession. However, with Arridy speaking so little during Aguilar's confession, one can cast doubt on that claim. One can also cast doubt on Arridy's signature on the confession itself. Though Aguilar had multiple witnesses signed beneath his mark, Arridy did not. Perhaps none of the witnesses in the room wanted to get charged with perjury in the future. But this is just speculation, and only those present know truly why they did not sign under Arridy's name. Aguilar himself would only cast doubt on the validity of the entire confession. He tried to recant it later, claiming that the warden had visited him and said some bad things would happen if he did not confess to the crime. Regardless of all the mystery and doubts surrounding this confession, the district attorney decided that it would suffice to be the confession for both of the men. A Colorado courtroom would have to determine whether the confession was coerced or not. Within 3 months of Aguilar's arrest, his trial began on November 27, 1936. Bolstering the shoddy confession was another statement made by the girl's father, Riley Drane. During his testimony, he claimed that in the time before the trial started, Aguilar had separately confessed to him the details of the crime. Mr. Drane said that Aguilar's story went as follows. After working for the day, he bought a pint of whiskey and got drunk. A friend of his awoke him and said that Aguilar needed to repay him some money. Aguilar then went with the unknown man to the area near the Drane household. Here he met up with Joe Arridy and committed the assault and murder. However, the father's testimony was contradicted by his own daughter. Barbara, the lone survivor of the attack, testified about what she saw and heard that night in their bedroom. When the prosecutor asked if she could point to the man that attacked her, she stood up, walked over to Aguilar, pointed at him, and said, "That is the man." What's important to note here is that in this dramatic courtroom moment, Barbara made no mention of there even being a second man, much less Joe Arridy being there. But that would not matter since the prosecution claimed they had physical evidence that linked Arridy to their crime scene. On the Drane sisters' bed, numerous body and pubic hairs were left behind after the assault. Police collected all of these at the scene, and on that same day, hundreds of miles away at the Laramie County Jail, where Sheriff Carroll was interrogating Arridy, the police there took head and chest hair samples from Joe. During the forensic expert's testimony, he claimed that after carefully analyzing all the hairs recovered, he found a single hair that matched the samples police gave him for Arridy. Though the forensic techniques used to classify the hairs have since been discredited by modern forensic science, it is important to know that it was more than just the shoddy confession that would eventually seal Arridy's fate. Because of the dramatic testimony and physical evidence police recovered, like the axe head, Aguilar changed his plea on the last day of the trial to not guilty by reason of insanity. However, neither the judge nor the jury found his claim believable, since the jury found him guilty that day and the judge sentenced him to death soon afterward. Once Aguilar had been convicted, it soon came out that other women had identified Aguilar as the man who had attacked them too. Consequently, there had been a similar homicide just a few blocks away from the Drane household before Dorothy's murder. Pueblo police soon connected Aguilar to at least 2 other attacks. However, Aguilar would eventually be executed for the rape and murder of Dorothy Drane alone. It's unknown if police had known this information several months before, if it would have made a difference for Joe Arridy, and more than likely, it would not have done anything to change the outcome. After Aguilar had been sentenced to death, Joe's lawyer requested he was granted a sanity trial. Because of the signed confession and hair evidence, Joe's lawyer thought that the only way to save his life would be if he were found insane. If the trial found that Joe was, in fact, sane, he would certainly be convicted and sentenced to death just like Aguilar. The stakes could not have been higher. 3 separate state psychologists interviewed Arridy at length to prepare for the trial. Though each conducted an independent review, they all came to the same conclusion. Joe Arridy was severely mentally handicapped with an IQ of 46, but he was sane. These so-called medical professionals argued for a person to become insane, they at first had to demonstrate that they were at one time sane. Because Joe had always been this developmentally disabled, they argued that he had never had the opportunity to become insane. While the state psychologists might have considered Joe sane, the trial's purpose was to determine if Joe could tell right from wrong. When one reads through the court transcripts when Joe took the stand in his own defense, the evidence is clear that Joe barely understands his surroundings, much less right from wrong. When the prosecutor questioned him about what was going on, Arridy had no clue. He asked him questions like, "Do you know what a hatchet is?" Joe replied, "No." Joe said his father was at home when he asked where his father was. When the prosecutor said his father was standing next to him, Joe simply replied, "Uh-huh." When asked if he knew Frank Aguilar, he said he did not. It was clear from the 17 pages of court transcripts that Joe Arridy had no idea where he was, what he was doing, and even the basic facts and circumstances of the case. Despite this damning testimony, the jury was left to deliberate on whether Joe was sane or not. After almost 7 hours of deliberation, the jury came back and said they were deadlocked 6-6 on Arridy's sanity. After being ordered by the judge to continue deliberations at 9 p.m. that night, the jurors quickly came back with finding Arridy was sane at the time of the murder. Why the jury decided that he was sane is beyond comprehension. Even one of the psychologists said that though he was sane, Joe did not know right from wrong. However, the jury could have been swayed by the numerous police officers' testimony that Joe did seem normal when speaking to him. While normal might seem a bit of a stretch for someone who cannot even recognize their own father, the jury thought it best for Joe to fight for his life at trial. On April 12, 1937, Joe's 5-day trial began. His defense attorney's strategy was simply to make this trial another insanity defense trial. He told the judge that he would call no witnesses or experts to testify on Joe's behalf, and that he would start his defense after the prosecution had fully presented its case. The judge allowed the plan to proceed. The prosecution called the same 3 psychologists, as well as an additional 4th one. The 3 original ones all claimed as before that Joe did not know right from wrong, but stopped short of labeling him as insane. The 4th psychiatrist did label him as sane and knew right from wrong. The judge also got the opinion of Sheriff Carroll, who had conducted all the initial interviews with Joe. He said that because of his 30 years of law enforcement experience, that Joe was as sane as any other criminal he had interrogated. During the trial, the prosecution would call Sheriff Carroll to the stand 4 more times to question him regarding Arridy's confession, crime scene reenactment, and remorse. Sheriff Carroll made each of his statements without notes and with no written documentation, stating that his ironclad memory sufficed. Joe's defense attorney did not call anyone to testify on his behalf. Despite this, what's interesting to note is that Dorothy's father did testify, and what he left out is quite essential. He talked about all the circumstances leading up to the attack and the discovery of his daughters. However, he did not mention trying to meet with Arridy like he did Aguilar, nor did he mention seeing him at all. Perhaps even more damning was the lack of the star witness to the attack, Barbara Drain. Unlike Aguilar's trial, Barbara refused to testify at Arridy's trial. She never gave a reason, but one can clearly read from her testimony at Aguilar's trial that she believed Aguilar and Aguilar alone committed these heinous crimes. If only the rest of the people involved with the case had a shred of the integrity this little girl did. But unfortunately for Joe Arridy, they did not. After just 5 days, the jury convicted him of rape and murder, with the judge sentencing him to die alongside Aguilar. Though Aguilar was quickly executed in August 1937, Joe would continue to sit on death row for 2 years as his lawyer fought to save his life. While on death row, The warden of the prison, Roy Best, quickly became Arridy's only friend in his whole life. Best felt pity for the young man and frequently allowed him privileges he did not give other inmates. For example, Best allowed Joe to visit his home, where he's said to have befriended his younger nephew, and that his wife would make him homemade ice cream. Best also bought Arridy frequent gifts. Warden Best bought Joe coloring books, magazines, scissors to cut up the magazines, and a red toy car. However, Joe's most prized possession was the toy train he bought him for Christmas in 1937. Joe would play with that train all day and night, screaming things like, "Train wreck, train wreck," as his imagination soared far beyond his prison cell. Besides his defense attorney, Warden Best became one of Arridy's chief advocates and tried numerous strategies to spare his life. One of those strategies was petitioning the court for another insanity trial. The court agreed to it, but the Pueblo prosecutors kept fighting the warden and his defense attorneys every step of the way. Despite the intense backlash, the duo was able to secure 6 days of execution over the 18 months Arridy sat on death row. But as the pair ran out of avenues to plead for Arridy's life, they turned to the state superintendent, who served as the chief medical officer for all the sanitariums in Colorado. His written response to their pleas was that Arridy was as sane now as he was then, and used the opportunity to lambaste people like Joe, instead stating that people as disabled as him should be sterilized. With all of their appeals running out, the Supreme Court ruled in a 4-3 vote not to hear any more stays for Arridy. Soon after, the governor of Colorado ordered Warden Best that he was to execute Arridy on January 7, 1939. In preparing for his execution, the Catholic priest at the prison administered Joe's last rites to him. However, because Joe was so disabled, he gave him the last rites that the priest would give to a child. Each prayer the priest did with Joe had to be said 2 words at a time, the limit of Joe's language abilities. After giving him his last rites, Joe ate his last meal, the homemade ice cream the warden's wife had made that he had grown so fond of. Joe did not finish his ice cream and instead asked the guard to place the rest in the fridge so he could eat it later. While waiting for his impending execution, Arridy kept playing with his toy train, oblivious to the fate that soon awaited him. Warden Best spent these last few hours with him. Then it was time for the execution. As Joe walked to the gas chamber, Warden Best and Father Schaller, the prison priest, accompanied Joe into the seat. Joe appeared calm, and the warden held his hand while the guards strapped him into the chair. While he was being strapped in, Warden Best asked him what his vocation would be in the next life. It was common back then for inmates condemned to die to speak about what they would do after their death. Best asked if he still wanted to raise chickens, but after talking to the priest, Joe changed his mind and said now he wanted to play the harp. Warden Best smiled at the answer, and just as he did, the guards placed the black hood over his eyes. It was during this time that Joe showed his only sign of worry. However, Warden Best squeezed his hand tighter, and soon Joe smiled again. Warden Best said his goodbyes and left the chamber, leaving just Father Schaller. He too said his goodbyes and visibly wept as he left the chamber. With everyone else outside, the guards shut the door and executed Joe Arridy on January 7, 1939, when he was just 23 years old. Perhaps Joe Arridy's story would have been forgotten to time had it not been for the work of people like Robert Persky, who spent most of the 1990s documenting the case. After the release of his book, Deadly Innocence, in 1995, Arridy's story became known nationwide. Soon, people came together to honor his memory in positive ways. The group soon became known as the Friends of Joe Arridy, and the group started to campaign on his behalf. After enlisting the help of numerous volunteers, including the granddaughter of the defense attorney that sought to save his life, the Friends of Joe Arridy were blessed when a Denver attorney named David Martinez became so moved by the story that he took up the case for a posthumous pardon in 2008. After 2 years of research into the case, Mr. Martinez prepared a 523-page appellation for a full pardon from the governor of Colorado. After submitting it in October 2010, The governor's office released a 3-page media statement in January 2011 about the governor's decision to grant Joe Arridy a full and unconditional pardon. Not only did the governor pardon Joe, but he agreed that he was factually innocent. The governor went on to say that had this case happened today, there would never have been a trial. Unfortunately for Joe, that came over 70 years too late. However, it did solidify not just the state of Colorado, but the United States as a whole to right the wrongs of the past. With his pardon now in hand, one can only hope that Joe Arridy is playing his harp and raising chickens to his heart's content in the next life, looking down with a smile on his face, knowing that he now has so many friends that he never had in this world. The discovery of a murder in Philadelphia in October 1894 opened the door to a case few could believe. Marion Hedgepeth, a one-time cellmate of a man who went by the name H.M. Howard, informed police about a recent scam. It involved insuring a man named Benjamin Pitezel for $10,000 with the Fidelity Mutual Life Association in 1893 in Chicago, and then faking his death in a laboratory explosion by substituting a cadaver. All participants were then to split the insurance payment, but Howard had reneged and run off with the money. Hedgepeth was informing on him as payback, and his detailed letter about the scheme was passed along to the company. In short order, they realized that H.M. Howard was actually H.H. Holmes, clearly a swindler. A company representative who had already expressed suspicions about the death scene re-examined the circumstances surrounding the discovery of a body at 1316 Callowhill Street in Philadelphia. It had been found in a state of rigor mortis and so badly burned in the face from chemicals and sun exposure that the identity of the person could not be judged. Nevertheless, Holmes, accompanied by one of Benjamin Pitezel's children, had indeed identified this body from certain characteristics as the remains of Pitezel. After he'd collected the money, he disappeared with that child and 2 more of Pitezel's children. Given the details, company officers tried unsuccessfully to track him, so they hired agents from the Pinkerton National Detective Agency to go after the scoundrel. As these more experienced men followed his trail around the country, they gathered information about his numerous frauds, thefts, and schemes, including other insurance scams years earlier in Chicago that had provided him with funds to build a 3-story hotel. He was among the top swindlers they had ever come across, possibly the most accomplished. If he hadn't gotten greedy, he'd still be in business. But this time, they had him. They finally caught up to Holmes in November in one of his childhood haunts in Vermont, put him under surveillance, and gave the information to the police. On the afternoon of November 16, 1894, H.H. Holmes was arrested in Boston as he was preparing to leave the country by steamship. He surrendered easily, possibly believing that he could resort to his highly successful weapon, a glib tongue and a load of lies, to get him out of a tight spot. It's likely that he was further convinced of this when they told him that he was being charged with the rather petty theft of a horse in Texas. Secretly, he knew a lot more about what he'd done, but so did the police. Even so, neither side realized at that moment what they were dealing with. The best sources for the Holmes story are the documents from the case itself, Detective Frank P. Geyer's book on his experiences, which included evidence not used in court and which Geyer describes as one of the most marvelous stories of modern times, and the autobiographical pieces that Holmes penned. At first, Holmes told one story, which included mundane details about his life and a load of lies posed to cover up his crimes. And then he offered a sensational confession, which was printed at the time in the Philadelphia Inquirer, and all 3 documents are now available on a CD-ROM from Waterfront Productions. As well, since the Holmes story was an immediate sensation, editions of the major Philadelphia newspapers carried the story from the moment he was arrested, and in 1975, David Franke published The Torture Doctor, later found to have been read by healthcare serial killer Dr. Michael Swango. In addition, authors Harold Schechter and Eric Larson both have written exemplary renditions of the Holmes tale. Schechter tells the tale imaginatively as narrative nonfiction, while Larson places Holmes in the context of the development of the Chicago's World Fair in 1893. Larson's discussion about how he researched the book offers even more insight. He admittedly encountered some difficulty with the character of H. Holmes. Since the Philadelphia trial transcripts were limited to a single crime, he had performed the greater part of his monstrousness elsewhere. Larson found that many of the sources about this scoundrel were inconsistent, as well as interlaced with Holmes' own fantastic embellishments. In many instances, only Holmes ever knew what he had actually done. Larson describes how he agonized over recreating incidents to which there were no witnesses, and he admits that even with all his research, he still did not know by the end what had motivated Holmes to kill, and had only a slight understanding of psychopathy. Yet he does point out one real advantage to his work. One of the most striking and rather charming aspects of criminal investigation in the 1890s is the extent to which the police gave reporters direct access to crime scenes, even while the investigations were in progress. Thus, they acquired fantastic details, which they passed on to anyone who cared to take a look. As Geyer said, the story is among the most marvelous. As Holmes was being processed in Boston, an agent from the insurance company arrived whom he recognized, so he readily offered a confession of the fraud. In the glib manner of a polished liar, he said that the damaged corpse that he'd identified as Pitezel really had been a cadaver that he'd acquired and substituted to collect the money. The agent was amazed by Holmes's near-convincing performance. When asked to account for the Pitezel children, who were not now in his care, the suspect offered yet another convoluted tale. The children had been left with their father, who had gone to either South America or Florida. Carrie Pitezel, Ben's wife, could not corroborate any of Holmes's story, except that she was aware of the insurance scheme and that he had been moving her around from one place to another with promises of soon seeing her family. She was utterly confused about the entire experience, and her flustered manner convinced the interrogators that Pitezel was probably dead. They charged her with conspiracy and put her under arrest, although they also felt sorry for her. She seemed to have been caught in something that she barely understood. Because the scheme had occurred in Philadelphia, Detective Thomas Crawford arrived in Boston to escort Holmes back to the city of brotherly love. In Depraved, Schechter recounts how Holmes bragged to the detective along the way about his criminal career, admitting that he'd done enough in his life to be hanged 12 times over. He provided colorful tales about his various cons and claimed to have the ability to hypnotize people to do whatever he wanted. He even offered the detective $500 to let him perform this feat on him and escape. Crawford was unimpressed, declining the deal with grim humor. But when reporters later heard about it, they attributed supernatural powers to the scam artist. It was the age of Svengali, a character made popular in a contemporary novel by George du Maurier, Trilby, and Holmes was thought to have such abilities. Holmes even enjoyed this novel later in his cell. Holmes was eventually incarcerated in Moyamensing prison and remained there for several months. Larson indicates that his human, whitewashed cell was 9 feet by 14 feet, with a barred window and an electric lamp for light. He was well behaved, and despite the daily journalistic discoveries of yet more of his horrendous crimes, his guards apparently liked him. Some of them did favors for him, delivering the newspaper dailies so he could keep up with the details of the investigation. As he did so, he realized that he'd have to come up with a better confession. He was always scheming. Holmes admitted to police in December 1894 that rather than substitute a cadaver in a con with Pitezel, as he'd originally said, the corpse had actually been Pitezel, but he had not been murdered. According to the story Holmes now told, Pitezel and 2 other men, along with Pitezel's wife, were in on the scheme. Pitezel had rented the house at 1316 Callowhill, equipping it with bottles of chemicals as part of the appearance of a man having an accident. That was all well and good, but Holmes noticed how Pitezel was drinking and one day found him lying dead on the floor. Pitezel had apparently grown depressed and used chloroform on himself. Holmes arranged the body and proceeded with his plan to make it difficult to identify, destroyed a letter Pitezel had written, supposedly a suicide note, and staged the scene to look like the result of an accidental explosion. He then went out of town to await a newspaper item that indicated that the body had been found. He left the account like that, and several more months passed without any word from the children. Holmes had indicated to Carrie Pitezel that they were with a guardian, Minnie Williams, in England. On June 3, 1895, Holmes was tried for conspiracy to defraud an insurance company, But because the sentence would be light, his attorneys advised him to plead guilty, which he did. The sentencing was delayed for a later date, but even the papers were now pressing for information about the Peitzel children. They seemed to have disappeared, and reporters wanted to know where they were. So did Carrie Peitzel. Someone had to act. Detective Frank Geyer was assigned to the job, and he went later that same month on a highly publicized expedition to find the missing Peitzel children, or their remains, whichever turned out to be the case. He later penned a book about his international trek. Even after his mission was accomplished, he did not yet know exactly what kind of monster he was dealing with. He simply knew he had a job to do, a potentially unpleasant one, and he did it. Larson describes Geyer as a big man with a pleasant, earnest face, sporting a walrus mustache. Geyer's wife and daughter had died recently in a fire, so his loss weighed heavily as he went in search of children who possibly had been murdered. Holmes had offered no clues to assist, except to say that the children had been left with a guardian, with one female child posing as a boy. He even shed tears at the idea that someone should accuse him of killing innocent children, and Geyer said of him, "Holmes is greatly given to lying with a sort of florid ornamentation." The man, he believed, was an actor and accomplished con, so nothing he said could be trusted, especially in light of the fact that this so-called guardian of the children, Minnie Williams, was also missing, along with her sister Nettie, and both had once been closely associated with the suspect. Holmes had kept up with the news each day as papers were delivered to him, and had shifted the details of his story as the situation demanded. Geyer noticed this and noted how it fit Holmes's pattern of treatment of others. He played games and adjusted his strategy to whatever seemed necessary to move them around like pawns in some game he played to please himself. Such a matter of man made the detective uneasy. No one could know from what he said what was true or what he might be planning next. Yet Holmes did admit to having Alice Peitzel, 15, in his custody after she had helped him to identify her father's corpse for the insurance payoff, and to picking up Howard, 8, and Nellie, 11, and taking them with him. Alice and Nellie had written letters to their mother documenting their daily journey, which Holmes had collected but had never mailed, and which were found in his possession upon his arrest. He told their mother that they were in the care of Minnie Williams, a woman of means in England. This woman had likely kept back their letters, Holmes had suggested, in the interest of her own safety. Yet Geyer had found no trace of Minnie Williams or the children where Holmes had said she would be. In fact, the street name that Holmes offered for where to find her did not exist in London. Instead of going to England, where Holmes clearly was trying to direct him, Geyer focused his efforts on North America. On June 26, Detective Geyer set out by train into the Midwest with Alice's and Nellie's letters to orient him, along with photos of the children and of Holmes, and an inventory of items and clothing associated with them. No one in the DA's office expected to find any evidence at this late date and believed that Holmes had killed them and would have been careful to dispose of the bodies. Yet the insurance company had readily provided funds for the trip because it would not have to pay out for Peitzel's suicide, so Geyer agreed to make the effort. In Cincinnati, he showed photographs and asked around in various hotels for anyone who might have seen Holmes or the children, and he finally found someone who remembered the small group of travelers under the alias Alex E. Cook. It was a name Holmes had used in business matters before. That clerk pointed Geyer in another direction, and through much questioning, he came across a woman who had seen Holmes and a boy together in a house to which a large stove had been delivered. But Holmes had then given her the stove, apparently because he'd noticed that she'd been watching him. Geyer now felt that he had a firm hold on the end of a string which was to lead me ultimately to the consummation of my difficult mission. He went from there to Indianapolis, Holmes's next destination according to the letters. In this city, Geyer found a trail that gave him a good sense of where the children had been. Larson points out that it was an exceedingly hot day, which made the investigation more burdensome. Finally, however, Holmes's odd game became clear. He was moving his wife, one of 3, all of whom were unaware of the others, and the 3 children about in the same city without any party being aware of the other. Geyer could not understand why, if Holmes intended to kill the children, he would go to such effort and expense to move them so often. The puzzle deepened, and the fate of the children seemed darker still. Geyer then went to Chicago and Detroit, the town from which Alice had written the last of her letters to her mother, in which she expressed dismay that they were not together. He also learned to his surprise that Holmes had added a third party to his game, Mrs. Carrie Peitzel and her other 2 children. He had placed her 3 blocks from where he roomed the 3 children in his care, but had not allowed them to realize it or see one another. But Alice also wrote something from that location to her mother that made Geyer's blood run cold. Howard is not with us now. Going on to Toronto, Geyer looked up real estate agents to find out if a man had rented a house for only a few days. It took considerable time to impress each agent with the importance of making a careful search for us. He found a house that Holmes had rented, which was surrounded by a 6-foot fence. The family residing there knew about some loose dirt under the house. They dug it up, firmly believing they would find one or more of the children. To raise the suspense, they kept working as it grew dark, but they had to give up without finding anything. Geyer struck out there, as the renter turned out to have been a different man. Still, the intrepid detective felt certain the children had been killed somewhere in that town, so he persisted and found another rental that seemed suspicious. He went to check it out. Geyer learned that a man with children at this place had asked for the loan of a spade to plant potatoes in his cellar and had brought only a bed, mattress, and large trunk to the house. A woman identified Holmes from a photograph as the man who had rented the house. Geyer went there, discovered that the house had a dark cellar accessible via a trapdoor, and found an area of soft dirt on the floor. When he pushed a shovel into it, a stench arose and he knew he'd come to the right spot. His long, dark journey had produced what he'd both hoped for and had feared: human remains. After digging 3 feet, he found a small arm bone, so he employed an undertaker to take charge. In short order, they exhumed the corpses of 2 unclothed girls, which they believed were Nellie and Alice Peitzel. Alice was found lying on her side with her hand to the west, Geyer wrote. Nellie was found lying on her face with her head to the south, her plaited hair hanging neatly down her back. A crew of men lifted them from the grave and transferred them to coffins. Gruesomely, as Nellie was lifted, her heavy braid pulled the scalp away from her skull. Geyer was widely congratulated on his persistence and success. He sent a telegram to Philadelphia about the day's events and concluded in his book, "Thus it was proved that little children cannot be murdered in this day and generation beyond the possibility of discovery." Searchers found a toy in the house that was listed in Carrie Peitzel's inventory of things that her children had owned, which assisted Geyer in a firm identification of the remains, as did pieces of partially burnt clothing. Then they brought Mrs. Peitzel to Toronto to confirm. She was allowed to see the children's hair and teeth, as the remains were too putrefied for her to view. She recognized them instantly and swooned in grief. She now knew that Holmes had lied to her and had killed her children. But Geyer still knew that there was one more child to find, little Howard. His trek was not yet done, although it now appeared to be fully pessimistic. He used logic and items from the letters to determine that Howard had been separated from the girls before their arrival in Detroit, so it was time to return to Indianapolis. He arrived there on July 24th. As before, he proceeded to gain the assistance of real estate agents from around the city to learn the details of short-term rentals from the previous October. By this time, Geyer's trek had become of supreme interest to the nation, and the newspapers heralded his arrival. He was considered a real-life Sherlock Holmes, and people wanted to know his every step, the way they read a suspenseful piece of fiction. This was both a curse and a boon. He received many leads, which he followed, but most of them just wasted his time. "Days came and passed," he wrote, "but I continued to be as much in the dark as ever." Geyer feared that the bold and clever criminal might have bested him on this one. It seemed increasingly more likely that little Howard might never be found. Back in Philadelphia, Holmes avidly kept track of Geyer's journey. At first, he felt empowered, believing that Geyer could never find the children. But with the discovery of the girls' remains, things looked grim. He had to think up a tale to exonerate himself and place the blame on others. Even as he did so, investigators were analyzing the children's letters, and they sent ideas to Geyer. Some things had been overlooked or misunderstood, and with renewed care, Geyer discovered that the children had been in Indianapolis 4 days longer than he'd figured. He narrowed the frame of time that was unaccounted for to only 2 days, and then returned to Chicago to check on a child's skeleton recently found. It was not Howard. Nor would Holmes, when asked, yield a word of assistance. The king of fabricators threw the blame on another man as the likely perpetrator. Geyer traveled to several more places, but instinct told him to settle in Indianapolis and keep searching there. Despite the lack of success, Geyer continued to believe that he would make a breakthrough in this town. No less than 900 supposed clues were run out, he later wrote, but he needed a new strategy. He then went to the smaller outlying towns, going through them as systematically as he had done in Indianapolis. Then in Irvington, he struck pay dirt. A man who had rented a house in October remembered Holmes because his manner was so rude and abrupt, and he recalled that a boy had been with this irascible short-term tenant. Relieved and certain that he was at the end of the trail, Geyer proceeded to the rental property. There was no disturbance in the floor of the cellar that he could find, which discouraged him at first, but there was a trunk in a small alcove and near it some disturbed dirt. Geyer dug into the area but found nothing. In a barn, he found a coal stove, and remembering Holmes's earlier purchase of a large stove which he'd then abandoned, Geyer suspected that this was a clue. On top were stains that looked like dried blood. By telegram, Mrs. Peitzel identified the trunk as hers. Geyer left the place but returned when he heard there was news. A doctor who had poked around showed him pieces of charred bone, part of a skull and a femur, that he said had belonged to a male child. They'd found it in a pipe hole in the chimney. Geyer dismantled the chimney and found more human remains, a complete set of teeth and a piece of jaw, identified by a dentist as being from a boy 7 to 10 years old. At the bottom of the chimney, Geyer recorded, was found quite a large charred mass, which upon being cut, disclosed a portion of the stomach, liver, and spleen, baked quite hard. The pelvis of the body was also found. Plenty of witnesses had seen Holmes back in October when he was there and identified him from the photograph that Geyer carried. One man even recalled helping him to install the stove. Convinced he had finally, albeit tragically, found Howard Peitzel, and having it confirmed by other clues, Geyer enjoyed the best night's sleep he'd had in 2 months. The search for truth had finally reached satisfaction. It was now August 27th, fully 2 months after he'd left on this journey, and 5 weeks since he'd found Howard's unfortunate sisters. On September 12th, Holmes was indicted by a grand jury for the murder of Benjamin Peitzel. He entered a plea of not guilty, and his trial date was scheduled for October 28th. Even as he adopted a pretense for the court, people were learning much more about him in Chicago. Holmes, it seemed, had quite a list of murders to his name. Holmes, whose real name was Herman Webster Mudgett, had arrived in Chicago during the 1880s, already married to 2 women. The city was preparing for the World's Fair, or Great Exposition, which meant that there was plenty of opportunity for a clever man for fraud and theft. Eric Larson writes eloquently about the White City's development, describing the many hurdles its designers and investors encountered in the process, just barely preparing the massive grounds in time for business. Some 27 million people went through the exposition during its 6-month venue, which overtaxed the city's resources and inspired plenty of crime, most of which police could not investigate. Holmes was among those who took advantage. He planned ahead for the many visitors who would be searching for lodging as close as possible to the fair, knowing that among them would be the most vulnerable prey, single, naive women on their own who would easily succumb to a successful and charming doctor. He presented himself as a graduate of a prestigious medical school and a man of means. His first Chicago employment was as a prescription clerk at 63rd and South Wallace Streets, but he soon took over from Mrs. E.S. Holton, who then went to California with her daughter. Indeed, no one ever heard from them again, but Holmes took control of the shop. Across the road was a property on 63rd Street, which he bought. Soon he was gathering funds through murder and fraudulent schemes to build his 3-story, 100-room castle, as he referred to it. When he eventually felt the need to leave, he tried to burn it down to collect insurance. In this building, investigators now found evidence of even greater crimes than swindling and bigamy. Holmes had offered rooms to young women arriving to attend the fair, but many of those women associated with them had disappeared. In addition, he he had employed a number of young women who had also disappeared. From what could be reconstructed, it seems that Holmes had tortured and murdered these women, disposing of their corpses in his furnace in the cellar, or defleshing them and selling the skeletons to medical schools. Schechter describes what the place was like. Holmes's castle included soundproofed sleeping chambers with peepholes, asbestos-padded walls, gas pipes, sliding walls, and vents that Holmes controlled from another room. Many of the rooms had low ceilings and trapdoors in the floors, with ladders leading to smaller rooms below. The building had secret passages, false floors, rooms with torture equipment, and a specially equipped surgery. There were also greased chutes that emptied into a two-level cellar in which Holmes had installed a large furnace. There was even an asbestos-lined chamber with gas pipes and evidence of something having been burned inside. It was believed that Holmes placed his chosen victims into the special chambers into which he then pumped lethal gas, controlled from his own bedroom, and then watched them react. Apparently, he gained some fiendish pleasure from this activity. Sometimes he'd ignite the gas to incinerate them, or perhaps even place them in the elasticity determinator, an elongated bed with straps to see how far the human body could be stretched. When finished, he might have slid the corpses down the chutes into the cellar, where vats of acid and other chemicals awaited them. Many more details about Holmes's activities here can be found in Schechter's and Larson's books. Investigators discovered several complete skeletons and numerous incinerated bone fragments in the Chicago castle, including the pelvis of a 14-year-old, according to Blundell. There was also a blood-stained noose and a vault filled with quicklime. Yet Holmes insisted that he had nothing to do with any murders. Those people had either taken their own lives, he claimed, or were killed by someone else. Nevertheless, newspaper headlines described the Chamber of Horrors. The Chicago Tribune announced that the castle is a tomb, and the Philadelphia Inquirer described bones removed from the charnel house. It wasn't long before true crime pulp paperbacks were published to slake the public's thirst and to turn a profit. Authors searched far and wide for even more murders that Holmes may have committed as far back as 1879. Chicago police estimated his toll to be as high as 150. In Philadelphia, the Holmes Museum opened to the curious. But Holmes was ready. He'd always gotten his way with his gift of the gab, and he figured he could do so again, despite how the odds seemed stacked against him. He offered his memoir. To exonerate himself, Holmes, now 34, penned Holmes' Own Story, in which the alleged multimurderer and arch-conspirator tells of the 22 tragic deaths and disappearances in which he is said to be implicated. He included his supposed prison diary as an appendix, which Larson believes he invented rather than kept as a daily log. The diary is a boring rendition of his routine, probably intended to make him appear to be an ordinary Joe with an interest in books, and presented as a means for his betterment. He viewed the whole as a literary work, as befitted his narcissistic temperament, and claimed that he had written it with mature deliberation and against the protest of his attorney and acquaintances. He claimed that the murders he had been accused of were a blatant attempt to ensure that his trial would not be fair and impartial. He wanted to formally and publicly deny them all. Thus, he set out to offer a narrative of his entire life, including a full disclosure of his dealings with the Peitzel family. My sole object in this publication is to vindicate my name from the horrible aspersions cast upon it, he wrote, and to appeal to a fair-minded American public for a suspension of judgment. In his memoir, which he got a journalist to assist him to publish, Holmes described Gilmanton Academy, New Hampshire, the town in which he grew up, as Herman Webster Mudgett. He was born there in 1861 and claims to have experienced an ordinary life with an ordinary set of parents and a normal schoolboy routine. Larson disputes this, having learned from experts that psychopathic children are generally involved in conduct disorders and juvenile delinquency, but this is not always the case. Generalizations offer poor ways to get at the truth of individual cases, and since there's no evidence either way, we cannot know what Holmes's childhood was really like. He describes a turning point in his life as the day some older boys forced him into a village doctor's office and face-to-face with a skeleton. It was a wicked and dangerous thing to do to a child of tender years and health, Holmes says, though he admits that the experience cured him of his fears. He attributes his desire to go into medicine to this memorable incident. He also discusses his childhood lies and pranks and how his father punished him. It was in college, he says, where he did his first truly dishonest act. He represented a fraudulent book, earning money from it for his expenses. He received a medical school diploma, he says, from the University of Michigan in Ann Arbor, and then opened a practice. He then attempted unsuccessfully to commit his first insurance fraud, helping someone to fake his own death with a purloined cadaver. From there, he served a stint as a doctor in an insane asylum, which haunted him for years. He changed his name to H. Holmes and posed as a pharmacist in Chicago. That was an ominous start to his career. Holmes continues in his memoir with a poor me fashion, describing the ills that befell him and the hardships he endured before meeting Ben Pitezel in 1888. They fell into a partnership that involved various pursuits that financially benefited them both. Holmes also speaks about some of the missing women associated with him, so that he can assure readers that they did things such as announcing they were going to leave and disappearing on their own. He also indicated that many young women were alive and well and better off for having known him. As for Minnie Williams, who had disappeared without a trace, Holmes offered a story of a woman who had fallen onto difficult times, had an illegitimate child, and was suicidal. She had an abortion, felt terribly ashamed, and left everyone she knew. She served as his secretary for a time and often ate meals in his building, which he claimed would account for any bone remains that might be found in the furnace. His sister Nettie arrived, also referred to as Nanny, and in short order died. It seemed that Minnie had decided that Nettie fancied Holmes, so she struck her with a stool and killed her. Having often suffered from bouts of mania, she was quite without restraint in such matters. Holmes helped Minnie to place the body in a trunk and dump it into Lake Michigan. But from my sight it has never passed, writes Holmes about the incident, nor has there been a day, an hour since that awful night, that I would not have given my life if by doing so that of Nettie Williams could have been returned. Holmes then broke everything off with Minnie. She went away and he burned the clothing she left behind or gave it to Pitezel. No one heard from Minnie again, except for Holmes, supposedly, who said he helped her to handle her land investments in Texas. He also describes how he first met the Pitezel family and the business ventures into which he entered with Benjamin Pitezel. In the end, he insists that he had no motive to kill anyone and says that he was always quite generous, so that even avarice could not count, as it was inconsistent with his character. He also did not have a bad temper and had made no dishonest transactions. He also did not believe he was insane, having no mental illness in his family and no finding of it from doctors who had examined him thus far. Of the Pitezel situation, Holmes said that Pitezel was worth more to him alive than dead, so why would he have engaged in murder? In conclusion, he writes, I wish to say that I am but a very ordinary man, and to have planned and executed the stupendous amount of wrongdoing that has been attributed to me would have been wholly beyond my power. He asked the general public to withhold judgment of his guilt or innocence until he could disprove them at his trial. He would also work to bring justice to those for whose wrongdoings I am today suffering. However, this publication was so transparently self-serving that readers preferred the more lurid tales provided in newspapers. No one really believed Holmes's own story, although it is an interesting collector's item for criminologists. Holmes's attorneys attempted to get his trial continued but were unsuccessful. In addition, there is a struggle between Chicago and Philadelphia authorities, says Blundell, as to who would get to try him first, but he remained in Philadelphia. The trial commenced as scheduled on October 28th. It lasted 5 days. On the first day, Holmes tried to defend himself but proved unable to establish points in his favor. The best account of the trial comes from the speech, reprinted in Geyer's book, from the district attorney George S. Graham, who recounts it in detail. Yet he does not include some of the more interesting events. For example, from a distance, a phrenologist, John L. Capon, made an analysis of Holmes, which was published during the trial in the New York World. He described the repulsive face and pointed out that great murderers have blue eyes. Holmes's expression, Capon said, was cruel and inhuman, and his ears, twisted out of shape, stamped him as a criminal. This was all evidence of devilry and vice. In other words, Capon convicted a man not yet found guilty based on appearances alone. At the trial, also described in detail by Schechter, Holmes requested to defend himself. Judge Arnold allowed it, saying, "It's your constitutional right to try your own case." Holmes questioned prospective jury members, at which point his team of attorneys left the courtroom. Holmes demonstrated the coolness with which he handled stress and tried rejecting each person who said he had read the papers, but the judge pointed out that this was not considered a cause for challenge. In any event, this all occurred well before the Supreme Court would rule about the unfairness of pretrial publicity. The jury was seated and the trial proceeded. Holmes's request to defend himself, Schechter says, was unprecedented. No accused murderer had done it before in the United States, so several lawyers and law students attended. A reporter for the Philadelphia Inquirer described Holmes's performance in court as vigorous and remarkable. He was deferential to the judge, but nasty to the prosecutor. He asked for an analysis of the liquid that he was accused of using as a poison for the children, which the DA did not have in his possession, and he wanted the most recent work done on toxicology, claiming that as a doctor, he himself could analyze it, though his credentials were false. This left the impression of a man who was prepared to use science to exonerate himself. Yet Holmes often deflected the questioning with forays into minutiae, and he frequently squabbled with the prosecutor, who was likely disturbed at having to spar in court as an equal with the defendant. Holmes made an error when, after Peitzel's corpse was described in gruesome detail, he requested a lunch break as he was hungry. He appeared to have no sense of sorrow over the supposed suicide of a partner and friend. For the rest of that day, while he handled his questioning in a professional manner, he failed to elicit any points to support his innocence. The professional witnesses all concluded that Peitzel could not, as Holmes claimed, have committed suicide. The judge ordered an evening session over Holmes's protest. Holmes claimed that he was feeling ill, but it was clear that he was failing to establish his case. The evening session opened with a surprise. Holmes asked that the court allow his two defense attorneys to re-enter the case, and with that, he relinquished his role as a criminal lawyer. While he now had competent counsel, he had probably hurt his case. Between his antics and his obvious fatigue by the end of the first day, the jury had a good look at the defendant's loss of confidence and inability to shake the strongest witnesses. He may not have admitted his guilt, but his actions indicated that he had admitted defeat. He got up only once to examine another witness, his latest paramour and third wife, who testified against him. Using a heavy dose of emotion, as if stricken by her betrayal, he nevertheless failed to move her to change her testimony about his behavior on the day that Peitzel was allegedly murdered. The prosecution made its case quite elaborately, prepared to show his activities from 35 witnesses from the various places Holmes had gone after the Peitzel murder. But the judge had ruled that the trial must be limited to the Peitzel murder, so Graham showed how they made Peitzel's identification, and adding in whatever they were allowed about Holmes's reprehensible behavior. They proved with doctors that the chloroform that had supposedly killed Peitzel by self-administration actually had been forced into him after he was already dead. So Peitzel was dead and had not died from natural causes or his own hand. Given Holmes's admissions about being with him, there was really no other choice for jurors. In addition, Carrie Peitzel had won the courtroom with her mournful rendition of learning that her children were dead. In his closing argument, which lasted more than 2 hours, Graham called Holmes the most dangerous man in the world and asked jurors not to be afraid to do their duty and operate like honest men. In the end, the jury convicted Holmes of Benjamin Peitzel's murder, and the judge sentenced him to death by hanging. After his conviction, and as his attorneys prepared an appeal for a new trial, which failed, Holmes took up the pen again to make a confession, largely inspired by a promise of a $10,000 payment from the Hearst newspaper syndicate. He published it in the Philadelphia Inquirer. It was his third full-blown tale to date about his activities with the Peitzel incident. Aiming now to become the most notorious killer in the world, he claimed to have killed more than 100 people. Apparently having second thoughts, he reduced that number to 27, including Peitzel and his children. He insisted that he could not help what he'd done. "I was born with the evil one as my sponsor beside the bed where I was ushered into the world," he lamented. The reading of his death warrant had been carried out, and he faced execution by hanging on May 7th. "It now seemed a fitting time, if ever," he wrote, "to make known the details of the 27 murders, of which it would be useless to longer say I'm not guilty." He admitted that there was overwhelming proof for his complicity in these deaths, and said that he would address only those cases that had been investigated, and hoped the people would not, therefore, suppose from his silence on others that he must be guilty. It seemed to him sufficient that Detective Geyer had gone over his life with a fine-tooth comb, so to speak, and there was really no place to hide. Holmes claimed that he wanted to make the confession at this point for several reasons, and he chose the Philadelphia Inquirer as his medium for making his revelations public. He assured his readers that he was not seeking attention and that the entire enterprise was distasteful to him. As he admitted to the murders, he said he was thus branding myself as the most detestable criminal of modern times. Indeed, he was. He sensed that his own countenance was changing as he sat in prison, and that he looked more satanic than before. "I've become afflicted with that dread disease, rare but terrible, a malformation. My head and face are gradually assuming an elongated shape. I believe fully that I'm growing to resemble the devil, and that similitude is almost completed." He self-diagnosed acquired homicidal mania and degeneracy, which meant he was a moral idiot. The criminological theories at the time were fueled by Cesare Lombroso, an Italian anthropologist and professor at the University of Turin. By 1876, Lombroso had published L'uomo delinquente. Believing that human behavior could be classified with objective tests, Lombroso was convinced that certain people were born criminals, identifiable by specific physical traits, such as bulging brows, long arms, and ape-like noses. They were throwbacks to more primitive times, and he called them degenerates. Lombroso's ideas had spread quickly across Europe and America, supported by the new evolutionary thinking. Thus, Holmes fell into this erroneous diagnostic mania. In another decade or so, Lombroso would be discredited. Yet, in keeping with the theory, Holmes saw a prominence on one side of his head and a corresponding diminution on the other side. Also, a deficiency in his nose and ear, and the lengthening or shortening of various limbs. One criminologist who saw him pronounced him guilty just from his appearance. Holmes said he was confessing in part to justify the scientific deductions. Little did he know they weren't scientific at all, but his motive was more likely to bring attention to himself and to wallow in one last flight of grandiosity. No doubt he enjoyed the idea of having an effect on an audience. His first murder, he admitted, was by overdose of laudanum of a former schoolmate for insurance money. Holmes claimed, probably falsely, that it had given him a terrible guilty conscience, but he'd then developed an appetite for blood. The second murder, he said, was accidental, when he got into a physical altercation with a man who owed him money. Then he killed a few people to sell to a corpse dealer for payment of $25 to $45 apiece. Later, he lost touch with this dealer, so he sometimes buried victims in the dirt floor of his offices. Some victims he poisoned, some he bludgeoned, and a few he closed into his vaults for gassing and asphyxia, a slow and lingering death. Most of these cases involved money, threat of exposure, or some other form of enrichment for Holmes. Sometimes he used confederates as accomplices. In one case, when he attempted to murder 3 young women at the same time with chloroform, they escaped and turned him in. Holmes was arrested, but inexplicably not prosecuted for attempted murder or even for assault. In some cases, Holmes either did not know or could not recall the name of a victim or near victim. Readers were most interested in what Holmes might say about the Williams sisters and the Peitzel family, and for both he provided quite a few details, although how much is true is anyone's guess. Holmes made a point to affirm the Christian character of Minnie Williams, and he retracted many of the statements he had made about her regarding her state of mind and her alleged murder of her sister. She was never in an asylum or secreted away to protect her reputation, he now said. He'd first met her in 1888 in New York and then encountered her 5 years later in Chicago. He persuaded her to give him several sizable sums of money and then maneuvered her to invite her sister to Chicago so he could get a bead on their property in Texas. Nanny or Nettie assigned her worldly goods to him, he said. After that, Holmes writes, she was immediately killed in order that no one in or about the castle should know about her having been there, save the man who burned her clothing. To his chagrin, she did leave something behind, her footprint on the door of the vault, which she produced during an unsuccessful struggle to survive. This was how Chicago authorities hoped to prove she was murdered. Holmes told Minnie that her sister had given up her journey north. He then secured Minnie's property in his own name and killed her as well. He poisoned her and burned her in the cellar of a house that he owned. He tried to implicate her as the murderer of her sister and the Peitzel children, which he was now repudiating. This is the saddest and most heinous of any of my crimes, he commented. Next, he turned his attention to Peitzel. Holmes indicated that from the first hour they met, he knew that he would kill the man. Everything he did for Peitzel that seemed to be a kindness was merely a way to gain his confidence. Peitzel met his death on September 2, 1894. Holmes wrote fake letters from Mrs. Peitzel to show him, which precipitated a bout of drinking. Holmes watched and waited until he was able to come upon Peitzel in a drunken stupor in the middle of the day. He packed his bags in readiness to leave, and then went to where Peitzel lay in bed, bound him, saturated his clothing and face with benzene, and lit a match. He literally burned his former accomplice alive. Apparently, Peitzel cried out and prayed for mercy, begging Holmes to end his suffering with a speedy death, all of which had on me no effect. When Peitzel finally expired, Holmes extinguished the flames, removed the ropes, and poured chloroform into his stomach to make the death appear to be accidentally brought about by an explosion. That way, the insurance company would quickly pay the full amount of the claim. He left the body in a position that exposed it to the sun for however long it would be before someone had found him, presumably to further deform it for difficulty in identification. I left the house, he wrote, without the slightest feeling of remorse for my terrible acts. However, Holmes said, the chloroform apparently also had the effect of depriving the tissues of alcohol, so that no one would know that Peitzel had been in a drunken state. At any rate, Peitzel was still recognizable. More bizarre, Holmes says that 3 weeks later he visited the grave where Peitzel was buried and pretended to be acquiring samples for microscopic analysis. He said he found that cutting into the corpse with a knife was inordinately satisfying. As for young Howard Peitzel, Holmes also had a story to tell. He had every intention of murdering the 3 Peitzel children, so he hid them in a hotel until he could find a way that would not draw suspicion. After a week, he poisoned the boy and then cut him into pieces small enough to go through the door of a stove he had purchased. He felt nothing about these acts, only the pleasure he gained from killing another person. He then took the girls to Chicago, Detroit, and Toronto. There, Alice and Nellie Peitzel met their fate. They were the 26th and 27th of his victims. He made them believe they would soon be reunited with their mother, whom he had also brought to Toronto in some diabolical game, while he plotted how he'd get rid of them. He compelled them both to get inside a large trunk and closed them inside, leaving an air hole. He then returned and pumped gas into the hole to kill the girls, even as their mother was traveling on to New York. He dug shallow graves, removed their clothing, and dumped them without a thought. He considered that for 8 years before their deaths, I had been almost as much a father to them as though they had been my own children. He had a plan to end Mrs. Peitzel's life, along with those of her 2 remaining children, with nitroglycerin, but he was arrested in Boston before he managed to achieve this. He closed his confession by saying that his last public utterance would be of remorse for these vile acts. He did not expect anyone to really believe him, and Geyer later says in his book that Holmes's account, published in many papers on April 12, 1896, was so inconsistent with the facts that they had gathered about the Peitzel children's demise that it was at once discredited in police circles. Then, in one quick move, according to Geyer, Holmes recanted the confession. And in fact, it was learned that several of his victims were not dead at all, or had died in ways clearly unassociated with him. When told by police that his tale was untrue, he supposedly said, "Of course it's not true, but the newspapers want a sensation, and they got it." Nevertheless, police did believe what he had said about the murder of Benjamin Peitzel. Geyer found it vile that Holmes would not tell the truth even as he stood on the brink of eternity. On May 7, 1896, H. Holmes went to the hangman's noose. His last meal was boiled eggs, dry toast, and coffee. Even at the noose, he changed his story. He claimed to have killed only 2 people and tried to say more, but at 10:13, the trapdoor opened and he was hanged. Blundell says that it took him fully 15 minutes to strangle to death on the gallows. Afraid of body snatchers who might capitalize on his corpse, Holmes had made a request. He wanted no autopsy, and he instructed his attorneys to see that he was buried in a coffin filled with cement. This was taken to Holy Cross Cemetery south of Philadelphia, and 2 Pinkerton guards stood over the grave during the night before the body was finally interred into a double grave, also filled with cement. No stone was erected to mark it, Larson states, although its presence is recorded on a cemetery registry. Holmes's attorneys had turned down an offer of $5,000 for his body, and even refused his brain to Philadelphia's Wistar Institute, which hoped to have its experts analyze the organ for better understanding of the criminal mind. Larson recounts a series of strange events afterward that gave credence to the rumors that Holmes was satanic, including several weird deaths and a fire at the DA's office that destroyed everything there, save a photograph of Holmes. During this case, another American phenomenon arose from society's fascination with sensational crime. Thousands of people lined up to see the Chicago murder site, so a former police officer remodeled the infamous building as Holmes's Horror Castle, an attraction that offered guided tours to the suffocation chambers and torture rooms. But before it opened, it mysteriously burned to the ground. So many people who'd rented rooms from Holmes during the fair had actually gone missing that sensational estimates of his victims reached around 200, and some people perpetuated this unsubstantiated toll even today. It's likely that Holmes's own figure from his recanted confession is low, but there's no way to know just how many he actually killed. Peter Dupas was a predatory sex monster of the worst kind, a cruel and calculating fiend who meticulously went about his depravity and could then melt into a crowd in a heartbeat. A man so ordinary and inconspicuous that it was almost impossible to believe that he could commit such atrocities. That is the way his victims saw him, and, time and again, they allowed him into their company. He left those who survived so traumatized that some could never again go to sleep with the light off or walk down their own hallway unaccompanied. No sooner was Peter Dupas out of jail than he would reoffend, each time worse than the last, until he killed and was finally locked away, where he would never be allowed to hurt anyone again. Born into a loving home in Sydney on July 6, 1953, Peter Norris Dupas was the youngest of 3 children and, as an infant, moved with his family to Melbourne, where he grew up in the Frankston and Mount Waverley areas. Peter's brother and sister were many years older than he, and his parents, who were old enough to be his grandparents, treated him like an only child. He claimed later that he was a spoiled child, made to feel inadequate by his overprotective mother and perfectionist father. Teased by the other kids at school because he was a slow learner and prone to be overweight, his nickname was Pugsley, after the boy in the TV show The Addams Family. Dupas grew up as the class dunce and repeated Form 1. At age 15, Dupas embarked on his criminal career in a fashion that would become his trademark, attacking women with a knife. On October 3, 1968, while wearing his school uniform, Dupas went to the house next door and asked his friendly 27-year-old neighbor, who was nursing her 5-week-old baby, if he could borrow a sharp knife so he could peel some potatoes. As the woman commented on what a good boy he was for helping his mother with the cooking, he lunged at her with the knife and stabbed her in the stomach without saying a word. "He knocked me down onto the floor and fell on top of me," the woman told the police. "He kept on stabbing me with the knife, and I kept trying to ward him off. I felt the knife cut into my hands, mainly my right hand, my face, and my neck. I was holding on to the knife at one stage, trying to break the blade. I was lying on my back, and he was sitting on top of me. He said, 'It's too late. I can't stop now. They'll lock me up.'" After covering her mouth with his hand and repeatedly bashing the woman's head on the floor, Dupas stopped as abruptly as he had begun. He told police he didn't know why he had attacked his neighbor and that he would never intentionally hurt anyone. "I can remember having the knife in my hand," Dupas told police. "I must have been trying to kill her or something." The teenage assailant was taken to Lorendale Hospital for psychiatric assessment. It was concluded in the court that he was caught in an emotional conflict between the need to conform to the expectations of his parents and the unconscious urges to express his aggression and his developing masculinity. Dupas was put on 18 months probation and told to undergo psychiatric evaluations. He left the horrors of school and took up an apprenticeship as a fitter and turner at General Electric in nearby Notting Hill. As is the case with a lot of socially unacceptable serial sex offenders who get their kicks out of dominating and dehumanizing defenseless women. While doing his apprenticeship, Dupas applied to join the police force so he could exert his authority legally, but he was rejected for being 1 centimeter too short. On March 10, 1972, a man chased and caught 19-year-old Dupas after finding him peeping through the bathroom window at his wife in the shower. On November 15, 1973, Dupas was interviewed by police after a motorist reported that he had repeatedly driven alongside the complainant's car, staring and smiling at his 12-year-old daughter. 2 weeks later, detectives from nearby Nunawading arrested and charged Dupas with the rape of a married woman 3 weeks earlier on November 5, 1973. They alleged that Dupas had asked his victim for help claiming his car had broken down outside her home. While the woman was looking for a screwdriver, Dupas hid in the house, then threatened the woman and her 18-month-old baby with a knife before raping her. Police alleged that in the 2 weeks before he was picked up, Dupas had tricked his way into 2 homes with the same ruse, but had left without assaulting either woman. He stole money from the first house and left, and fled from the second when the woman told him her husband was on the way home and would be there any minute. Even in those early days, arresting detectives saw the potential danger in Dupas, and the leader of the investigation, Senior Sergeant Ian Armstrong, described him to reporters as an evil, cold, baby-faced liar who would probably cause the death of one of his victims if he wasn't straightened out. The investigating detectives discovered that Dupas was a consummate liar and a frustrating interview subject, as even in the face of overwhelming evidence, he would deny everything. Then he would break down, and just when it looked as though he was about to make a confession, he would straighten himself up and deny everything again, and they would have to go back and start again from the beginning. Detectives also discovered that Dupas was no ordinary rapist who chose his victims at random. He was organized to the point where he had everything worked out down to the last detail. He had pre-chosen his victims and went about his business in a very cold and calculated fashion, remaining calm at all times, even when arrested. He was a cool, cunning liar, Detective Armstrong told reporters. You'd look at him and think, could he be this callous, this dangerous? But I knew this guy would be a danger. You could smell it. After being charged with rape and released on bail, Dupas was remanded to Mont Park Psychiatric Hospital, where he was allowed to come and go as he pleased. While still attending Mont Park, Dupas was arrested for a series of incidents at nearby Rosebud Beach. He was seen on at least 3 occasions entering a female toilet and shower block and watching girls showering before he was trapped in a police stakeout. Dupas was taken back to Mont Park and admitted as a voluntary patient, where he stayed put from January 8th to February 22, 1974. Charged with loitering with intent and offensive behavior over the Rosebud allegations, the court heard that while psychiatrists at Mont Park were unable to find any gross psychiatric disorders within the 21-year-old Dupas, they did not exclude the possibility of personality problems for him in the future. Dupas was fined $140. 6 months later, at his sentencing for the Nunawading rape of the married woman on November 5, 1973, the judge was not so lenient. County Court Judge John Leckie didn't hold back as he berated Dupas for what he described as one of the most appalling rapes that could possibly be imagined. You raped a young married woman who was previously unknown to you in her own home and on her own bed, he told the prisoner. You invaded the sanctity of her home by a false story about your car breaking down. You threatened her with a knife. You tied her up with a cord. You struck her when she tried to resist. And worst of all, you threatened to harm her baby when she tried to resist. Whilst accepting that you are psychologically disturbed, Judge Leckie said, I believe you were fully responsible for your actions. And in what would be a fatally accurate prediction, Dr. Alan Bartholomew, one of Australia's most experienced forensic psychiatrists who had examined Dupas while he was in custody, told the court, I am reasonably certain that this youth has a serious psychosexual problem, that he is using the technique of denial as a coping device, and he is to be seen as potentially dangerous. Judge Leckie sentenced Dupas to 9 years in jail with a non-parole period of 5 years. Jail and attempts at rehabilitation obviously had no effect on Peter Dupas, and a little more than 2 months after his release on September 4, 1979, after serving 5 years and 8 months, he attacked 4 women over a 10-day period, leaving them psychologically damaged for the rest of their lives. This time he was equipped with what would become his trademark, a knife and balaclava. Dupas raped his first victim in a Frankston public toilet block. His next 3 victims escaped, but one, an elderly woman, was stabbed in the chest as she offered as much resistance as she could muster in an attempt to escape. His attempt at rape foiled, Dupas bolted. The woman told police that as she started getting to her feet after her assailant had run away, she realized that blood was pouring from the left side of her chest. She had been stabbed. When picked up by police, he confessed to all of the attacks, said that he was glad that he had been caught, and said that he had fled from the last 2 attempted assaults when the woman started screaming. His only explanation for the attacks was that he gets the urge. Dupas told arresting officers in a recorded interview, "It just comes over me. I can't help myself. I've had this problem for about 6 years. It all started again about a year ago. I don't know if it was because my girlfriend left me or what it is. I just find it hard to mix with people and I haven't many friends. I just don't know what to say." Dupas was charged with rape, 3 counts of assault with intent to rape, malicious wounding, indecent assault, and assault with intent to rob. Judge Leo Lazarus presided over the case, and when Dupas was found guilty on all counts, the judge shocked the prosecution by handing down what they considered a meager 6-year sentence, with a 5-year non-parole period, despite the fact that it was Dupas's second time around for rape, and he was in on considerably more charges than his previous conviction. 4 days after he was released on February 27, 1985, after serving 5 years and 3 months, Dupas raped a 21-year-old receptionist as she lay sunbathing at Blair Gowrie Back Beach. 2 men, the distraught victim, had asked for help, caught Dupas as he walked along the road away from the beach after he had misplaced his car. Dupas could offer no explanation for his behavior, only that he was enjoying himself on the beach, having an easy day, laying back, when he saw the woman and couldn't help himself. Dupas said that he was sorry for the attack, that everyone had assured him that he was all right now, and that all he wanted to do was to live a normal life. Dupas also couldn't help police with their inquiries into the murder 16 days earlier, while he was on temporary leave from prison, of sunbather and mother of 4 Helen McMahon, who was beaten to death in the sand dunes at Ryback Beach, 4 kilometers away. Once again in court for rape, Dupas was not to be as fortunate as he had been with the benevolent judge Leo Lazarus. Instead, he had again to confront Judge John Leckie, the same judge who had verbally caned him before sentencing him to 5 years jail on the Nunawading rape 11 years earlier, to add to Dupas's woes. In the interim, Judge Leckie had been critical of the previous lenient sentence handed down by Judge Lazarus, saying it was inadequate. Judge Leckie told the court that Judge Lazarus's attempt to rehabilitate Dupas 5 years earlier had failed miserably and showed no compassion to the prisoner, as he described Dupas as walking around with a loaded time bomb in his pocket. Judge Leckie sentenced Dupas to 12 years in prison with a minimum of 10 years before he could apply for parole. In prison, Dupas underwent medical treatment to reduce his sex drive. In 1987, while still a prisoner in Castlemaine Jail, Dupas married a nurse 16 years his senior. A Mont Park psychiatrist said later, he believes all of that is behind him since he understands himself better and has become more assertive. Released on March 3, 1992, after serving exactly 7 years, Dupas lay low for 18 months. On September 23, 1993, he attacked a 15-year-old girl who was horse riding at Kyneton. Fortunately, the girl had the common sense to put her horse between herself and the attacking Dupas, and she escaped unscathed. Dupas escaped unidentified. On January 3rd at 11:30 a.m., Dupas attacked a 26-year-old bank teller who was spending the weekend with her fiancé and 3 friends at a holiday house near Lake Eppalock in northwestern Victoria. As she sat on the toilet in a public restroom, Dupas burst into the cubicle wearing a hood with eye holes, and pointing a knife at the woman's face. Dupas kept yelling for the woman to turn around and face the wall, but she resisted. The woman was cut badly on the hands as she fought to prevent her attacker from dragging her out of the public cubicle. Thwarted, Dupas abruptly stopped the attack, let the woman go, and calmly walked away to his car. As Dupas sped off, the woman identified him to her fiancé, an off-duty Australian federal police officer, who, with friends, chased the station wagon before overpowering Dupas after his car ran off into the bush on a dirt road. Police found a roll of insulation tape and a pair of metal handcuffs in Dupas's pockets. In his car, they found a grisly cache of the tools of the trade of a well-prepared traveling rapist: knives, balaclava, condoms, a roll of sticking plaster, and, chillingly, a sheet of plastic and a shovel. Despite what police saw as Dupas's meticulous planning of what would be a sexual abduction, murder, and concealment of the body, disappointed prosecutors told Judge Leo Hart that they did not have enough evidence to sustain a charge of attempted rape against Dupas, and, unfortunately, charges would have to be reduced to the much lesser charge of false imprisonment. It was a bitter blow to the police and the prosecution. Under recently introduced Victorian legislation designed to deal more severely with serial sex offenders, they could have put Dupas away for an indefinite period where he couldn't harm any more innocent women. But seeing as the prosecution didn't have the likelihood of getting a sexual conviction and risked the prospect of having to let Dupas get away with no conviction at all, instead, Judge Hart could only proceed with the matter presented before him and sentenced Dupas to just 3 years and 9 months in jail, with a minimum of 2 years and 9 months after he pleaded guilty to false imprisonment. During the proceedings, the court had been told that the woman Dupas attacked and tried to abduct was still too scared to even walk down the passage from her bedroom to the toilet at night. Dupas served the full minimum term and was released on September 29, 1996, to find his wife had left him. He got a job as a factory worker and lived for a short time in an apartment in Rose Street, Brunswick. Later, he moved in with a woman who knew nothing of his background in Coan Street, Pascoe Vale, near a busy Cumberland Road shopping area. On October 4, 1997, a local prostitute and recovering heroin addict, 40-year-old Margaret Marr, who stopped at Pascoe Vale regularly, was abducted and murdered. Marr's body was found in long grass on industrial land near Clifford's Road, Somerton. Marr had been stabbed many times, and her breasts had been grotesquely mutilated. 4 weeks later, on November 1, 1997, Marcina Halvagas, 25, was repeatedly stabbed and left to die between graves as she was laying flowers on the grave of her grandmother in the nearby Faulkner Cemetery. By a strange coincidence, the grave of Peter Dupas's grandfather is buried at Faulkner Cemetery, only 100 yards away from where Halvagas was murdered. At 6:30 a.m. on New Year's Eve, 1997, Kathleen Downs, a frail 95-year-old who had suffered 2 strokes and had difficulty in walking, was found stabbed to death in her room at Brunswick Lodge Nursing Home, where she had lived for 8 years. Detectives established that phone calls were made from Dupas's Pascoe Vale home to the Brunswick Nursing Home in the weeks before Mrs. Downs' death. They were unable to establish any previous link between the 2 addresses or any reason for the calls to have been made. At around 6 p.m. on April 19, 1999, Rena Hoffman called on her friend Nicole Patterson at her Northcote home in Westgarth for tea. Hoffman became concerned when she couldn't get a response, so she entered the house, where Patterson worked from home as a consulting psychotherapist, to find her friend dead on her consulting room floor. Patterson was naked from the waist down. Her clothes had been ripped and cut. "I saw Nikki arranged naked, and there was blood near her, not actually on her," Hoffman told police. "She seemed cleaned up or something." An autopsy revealed that 28-year-old Nicole Patterson had been dead since that morning. She had been stabbed 27 times. There were numerous defensive wounds to both her hands. It was impossible to say if she had been raped. Both of Patterson's breasts had been sliced off and were nowhere to be found at the murder scene. Patterson's mutilations were similar to those of Margaret Marr, who was murdered on October 4, 1997. Patterson's neighbor heard a woman scream at 9:30 a.m., and another witness heard 2 shouts around about the same time. Another neighbor said she heard a scream of pain, not fear, and about 10 minutes later, she saw a man walking with a sort of intentness from the direction of Patterson's house. The killer had been thorough. He had cleaned up after himself. There were no fingerprints or footprints. It looked as though the house had been wiped down, and it appeared as if the killer had scoured the premises to see if he had left any clues. He had even taken Patterson's purse containing her driver's license and her mobile phone. But the killer had missed the most incriminating piece of evidence. Under clothing on the lounge, detectives found Patterson's appointment book. It contained a 9 a.m. appointment for a Malcolm that morning and a mobile phone number written next to it. Malcolm turned out to be a student who had no idea who Patterson was. Had he given out his phone number to anyone recently? The police asked. He had, and he gave the police a list. One of the names he was doing a bit of handiwork for, Peter Dupas, came up on the computer. Police put what they had together. Patterson advertised her business for clients in the local papers, so it wouldn't be hard to get into her house. Her killer had made an appointment under a false name for that morning, using a false mobile phone number to avoid detection. What he didn't count on was the police finding the appointment book. When the police raided Dupas's home, which was less than 30 minutes from where Patterson was murdered, 3 days after the murder, Dupas had a fingernail scratch on his face. A search of the premises uncovered a blood-stained green jacket in a bundle of clothing in a workshop cupboard. DNA testing showed that there was less than a 1 in 6.5 billion chance that the blood in 13 of the 14 drops on the jacket did not belong to Patterson. The other drop was Dupas's blood mixed with Patterson's. Investigators found a black balaclava and a page out of the Herald Sun with a report of the murder on it. The photo of Nicole Patterson in the article had been slashed. In Dupas's garbage bin, police found torn-up pieces of newspaper, and when the pieces were put together, they formed a handwritten note with the words 9 o'clock Nikki and Malcolm written on it. Police also confirmed that on the day of the killing, Dupas was caught on video buying gas near Patterson's home. Despite the mountain of circumstantial evidence, Dupas denied any knowledge of Patterson's death, saying only that the police must have planted the evidence on him in order to get a conviction. Peter Dupas was charged with the murder of Nicole Patterson and remanded in custody for trial. To her friends and family, and anyone who had even been remotely in touch with her throughout her life, Nicole Patterson's death was cruel and pointless. Nicole didn't have an enemy in the world. Of all of the things that an attractive, athletic, and intelligent young woman could have done with her life, she chose psychotherapy and dedicated much of her time to helping young people with drug problems. In her spare time, Nicole worked as a youth counselor at the Ardoc Center, an organization that endeavors to assist homeless or disadvantaged young people. She also assisted in activities associated with the Australia Drug Foundation. Nicole's life was her work, her partner of 20 months, Richard Smith, and her beloved dog, Bella, which she had rescued from an animal shelter. Her sister Kylie said of Nicole, "She was the most beautiful person I've known, and she has a lot of special gifts that not many people have." In early 1999, Nicole decided to extend her practice and set up the front bedroom of her home as a consulting room and advertised for clients in the local papers. Putting the pieces together, investigators believe that the man calling himself Malcolm made the first of 15 phone calls to her on March 3rd and eventually made an appointment for 9 a.m. April 19th on the pretext that he wanted to consult her about his chronic gambling problem. Police believe that after Dupas arrived at 9 a.m., he was ushered into the consulting room and attacked Nicole as she was making coffee for them both. Dupas set upon her, stabbing her viciously and repeatedly with a knife he had brought with him. But Nicole put up strong resistance, as was indicated by the shouting heard by the neighbors and the cuts to her hands. Once he had murdered Nicole, Dupas set about fastidiously cleaning the room up and removing any clues that might have led to him. Then he took her souvenirs, Nicole's purse, and her body parts. But fortunately for investigators, he missed the diary that led them straight to his door. At his trial held at the Supreme Court of Victoria before Justice Frank Vincent in August 2000, Dupas, who described his occupation as a part-time furniture maker, told the court that all of the evidence must have been planted by police because he had never been to Nicole Patterson's Northcote home. He said that if Patterson's blood was on his jacket, then it must have been planted there by police. He said that he did not have anything to do with Patterson after April 12, 1999, when he cancelled an appointment to see her about his gambling problem. Dupas said he did not contact Patterson on April 19th, the day she was murdered, or go anywhere near her house. He said that he only left his Pascoe Vale home on that day to buy milk and petrol, to do some shopping, and to pick up his de facto wife. Dupas said that while he was at home, he was washing clothes and other gear in readiness for a camping trip and working on a cocktail cabinet in his shed. David Brustman, acting for Dupas, told the court that there were issues about how his client's jacket came to have blood on it and whether the jacket proved anything. But there was no issue, he said, that 13 of the stains had Patterson's blood and that the 14th was a combination of her blood and that of Dupas. On the face of it, game, set, and match, Brustman told the jury, adding that the issue was not whether Dupas or someone else had done it. He said that the issue was, did he make an appointment and not keep it, or keep it in the most horrible way? In cross-examining Dupas, prosecutor Jeff Horgan pointed out that it must have been an amazing coincidence that out of all the jackets Dupas had in his home, the police sprinkled the deceased's blood on the one he was wearing the day she was killed. Horgan suggested that if this were the case, then the police must have carried around a vial of Nicole Patterson's uncongealed blood for 2 days in order to sprinkle it on the jacket on the day that he was arrested. On August 17, 2000, after 2.5 hours of deliberations, the jury returned a guilty verdict. At Dupas's sentencing hearing on August 23, 2000, Justice Vincent told him, "I note that you have an appalling criminal history involving repeated acts of sexual violence and which extends over approximately 30 years. You have admitted 16 prior convictions involving 6 court appearances between March 27, 1972 and November 11, 1994. All of the offenses were sexually related or motivated. A number of them involved physical violence and the use of a knife. On 3 separate occasions, you were sentenced to terms of imprisonment for the commission of rape, aggravated assault, or assault with intent to rape. On the 2nd and 3rd of these occasions, you committed your offenses within a very short time of your release from custody. It appears that the only periods during which you were at large in the community without committing offenses were 2 periods of approximately 12 months each, during which you were subject to strict parole conditions following your release from prison in 1992 and 1996. However, it was not long after that form of control was lifted by the expiration of the sentence to which it was related that you reverted to your usual type of criminal behavior. You regarded Nicole Patterson as nothing more than prey to be entrapped and killed. Her life, youth, and personal qualities assumed importance in your mind only by reason of the sense of satisfaction and power you experienced in taking them from her. At a fundamental level, as human beings, you present for us the awful, threatening, and unanswerable question, how did you come to be as you are? Justice Frank Vincent sentenced Peter Norris Dupas to be in prison for the rest of his natural life without the opportunity for release on parole. Peter Dupas has since been questioned about the unsolved mysteries of Margaret Maher, Mersina Halvagas, Helen McMahon, and Kathleen Downs. He has denied any involvement. As of 2006, Dupas is serving his sentences between the Maximum Security Protection Unit at Port Phillip Correctional Centre in Laverton and HM Prison Bar 1 in Lara, a northern suburb of Geelong. He has attempted suicide several times while imprisoned. Prison staff describe him as a model prisoner while in custody and a monster whenever released. On Friday, the 2nd of January 1981, the Yorkshire Ripper's 5-year reign of terror came to an end. In the previous 5 years, beginning in July 1975 with his first attack, he had killed 13 women and left 7 others for dead. The 7 survivors were told how lucky they were, but with physical, emotional, and psychological scars that would never completely heal, they didn't feel very lucky. Many would even believe that they would have been better off if the man they had known for so long as the Ripper had succeeded in killing them. As the nation celebrated the final triumph of good over evil, the Yorkshire Ripper's family sat stunned. It was incomprehensible to them that the Peter William Sutcliffe that they knew and loved could be responsible for the heinous crimes of the Yorkshire Ripper. Peter William Sutcliffe was the firstborn son of John and Kathleen Sutcliffe. He was born in Bingley, an industrial county of Yorkshire, England, on the 2nd of June 1946, weighing only 5 pounds, but healthy in every way. As they took him home from the hospital, both parents were confident that their son would grow to be like his father, a burly man who loved to play and watch any type of sport, and an extrovert who loved to drink at the local pub. John looked forward to the day that he and his son would share the manly pleasures of life. But Peter would not grow to be a man's man like his father. He was a quiet, shy boy who much preferred to stay indoors with his mother than join in the rough games of his younger brothers and sisters, choosing to read rather than play sport. Greatly intimidated by his father's aggressive masculinity, he found a haven in his mother, a gentle, loving woman who adored all 6 of her children. At school, which he always hated, Peter did not attempt to integrate with the other children. He would spend each play hour standing alone in a safe corner, away from the other children, avoiding the rough games from which he, being small and not particularly strong, invariably came out the worse for wear. His father's concern for his son during his primary years led him to visit Peter at the school each afternoon, hoping to encourage his son to join in with the other children, but to no avail. The move to secondary school was no better for Peter. He became the subject of severe bullying, culminating in his truancy from school for 2 weeks before his parents were informed of his absence. He had spent the 2 weeks hiding in the upstairs loft, reading comics and books by torchlight. Although the bullying stopped after the school took action, Peter, who never fought with other boys or chased after the girls, was seen as different, set apart from the rest. In the last years of secondary school, Peter attempted to fit in with the other boys and overcame the stigma of the outcast he had been given in his younger years. He took up bodybuilding and was soon, to his father's great delight, able to beat both of his brothers at arm wrestling. While still showing no signs of interest in girls, he would learn to play some sports to fit in, but his fear of leaving a mark or bringing attention to himself would cause him to never excel in any area of his schooling. He left school at the age of 15 with no clear focus on what he wanted to do with his life. Over the next 2 years, Peter would change jobs regularly. He started in the mill where his father worked, but within a few weeks left to begin an engineering apprenticeship, which he quit after only 9 months. His next job was as a laborer in a factory. But again, after only a short time, he quit to work as a gravedigger at the Bingley Cemetery. Peter continued to be devoted to his mother all through his teen years and would happily run errands for her and spend a great deal of time with her. Things were not so good with his father, who, Peter felt, spent far too much time away from the family home with sport and socializing, an issue that Peter had always resented. For John Sutcliffe, his greatest concerns about his son were allayed by the time Peter celebrated his 18th birthday. Although he never did share his father's love of sport, he had taken up bodybuilding and other manly pursuits, including a passion for riding and repairing motorbikes. The only concern was that Peter still showed no interest in girls and had never had a girlfriend. In his 20th year, while with friends at the Royal Standard, a hotel in Manningham Lane, Peter deliberately approached a girl for the first time. Her name was Sonia Surma, the second daughter of Maria and Bohdan Surma, immigrants from Czechoslovakia, now living in Bradford. Polish-born Bohdan, a physical education teacher and university lecturer in Czechoslovakia, was not happy with his daughter's choice at first, but in time he would come to see Peter as a hard-working man who was careful with money and, most importantly, who treated his daughter well. Sonia held hopes of becoming a teacher when she met Peter, and although they would not marry for another 8 years, the intention to marry had always been an unspoken expectation for the couple. In the eyes of John and Kathleen Sutcliffe, Peter had grown up to be the ideal son. As far as they could tell, his only flaw was his work record, which was tainted by his habitual lateness and eventually cost him his job at the cemetery, after which he held several laboring positions. By April 1973, this final problem seemed to be cured when he began his first steady job doing permanent night shift at the Britannia Works of Anderton International. In 1974, the family pressure for Peter and Sonia to marry had finally convinced them that they should do so, even if they hadn't yet saved for a deposit on a house, and Sonia had not been able to complete her teaching degree because of a schizophrenic episode during the second year into her course. With the decision that they would live together with Sonia's parents, they married on the 10th of August, Sonia's 24th birthday. Peter had succeeded in creating a public persona that was exemplary, described by many as hardworking and quiet, a caring and loving husband who kept to himself with no outward signs of the violence and depravity he had hidden deep within him. There were very few who had ever seen the other side of Peter. Gary Jackson, who had worked with Peter at the cemetery, had found his pleasure in playing morbid pranks with the skeletons and the theft of rings from the hands of some of those he buried to be more than a little macabre. His brother-in-law, Robin Holland, would often go out drinking with Peter in the red light districts of Yorkshire, where Peter would often brag about his exploits with the prostitutes in the area. While at home, he would continue to play the part of a family saint who would make grandstands about the immorality of men who two-time their wives. Eventually, Peter's hypocrisy became too much for Robin, and he refused to go out with them anymore. Trevor Birdsall had become friends with Peter at about the same time as he met Sonia, and would eventually report to police his suspicions that Peter Sutcliffe was the Yorkshire Ripper. Trevor and Peter would spend hundreds of hours over the next few years in pubs and cruising the streets of the red light districts in Peter's succession of cars. Peter seemed to have a liking for prostitutes, mixed with a fit of strange anger. Trevor remembered vividly a night in Bradford in 1969 when Peter had left him in the car for a few minutes. When he returned, Peter told him that he had tried to hit a prostitute with a brick he had put inside a sock, but the sock had fallen apart and the brick had fallen out. Despite his strange behavior, Trevor would remain friends with Peter until his arrest in 1981. 6 months after his marriage to Sonia, Peter Sutcliffe took the opportunity of a £400 redundancy package. He used the money to acquire his license to drive large trucks. On the 4th of June 1975, 2 days after his 29th birthday, he passed the HGV test Class 1 and then bought himself a white Ford Corsair with a black roof while keeping his first car, a lime green Ford Capri GT. During the following month, Peter was to tell friends and family of the sad news of Sonia's many miscarriages. Soon after the latest miscarriage, Peter and Sonia were informed that Sonia would not be able to have the children that they both had wanted so much. It was not long after this that Peter made his first reported attack. Anna Patricia Rogulski lived in Cayley. The slim, attractive blonde in her early 30s had been divorced from her Ukrainian husband for 2 years. On the night of July 4th, 1975, she and her boyfriend, Jeff Hughes, whom she expected to marry soon, had had a fight. Still angry, she had left him to go out drinking with friends at a club in Bradford. Her 2 Jamaican friends dropped her outside of her home at 1 a.m., where she expected to find her boyfriend. He wasn't there. Her earlier anger with him soon resurfaced, and she decided to walk across town to his house to finally sort things out. As she fruitlessly banged upon the door, Peter Sutcliffe stood in the shadows, watching. Finally, in frustration, she removed one of her shoes and broke the glass of a downstairs window. As she knelt to put her shoe back on, Peter quickly emerged from the shadows and struck her a savage blow to her head. Anna had not seen or heard anything and was unconscious as he dealt her another 2 blows with his hammer. Peter paused momentarily to catch his breath as the blood from Anna's wounds seeped across the cobblestones. He lifted her skirt and pulled down her underpants. As he returned the hammer to his pocket and took out a knife, his anger, under control until now, found expression with each slashing cut across her stomach. The voice of a concerned neighbor, disturbed by the noise, quickly quelled the frenzied outpouring of Peter's rage. As the neighbor stood peering out into the alley, trying to focus in the poor light, Peter Sutcliffe pulled himself together and spoke calmly as he reassured the man that all was well and to go back inside, which he did. Peter straightened Anna's clothing and was gone as quickly as he had come. After Peter returned home to his sleeping wife to continue his life, as usual, Anna was found and rushed to the casualty department of Airedale Hospital. From there, she was transferred to Leeds General Infirmary for an emergency operation that lasted 12 hours. At one point, she was read the last rites. Miraculously, she survived, but, unlike Peter, her life would never be the same after that night. She returned to her home where she would live alone with her 5 cats, barricaded behind a network of wires and alarms. She's terrified of strangers and rarely goes out. When she does, she walks in the middle of the street, and she's afraid of the shadows and terrified of people approaching her from behind. There's no boyfriend now, and no prospects of marriage. The £15,000 she received from the Criminal Compensation Board cannot buy back her life. She wishes that she had died that night. The police were mystified by the attack, which appeared to have no motive. No money was stolen, and it had not been a sexual attack. Her boyfriend and all of her friends had been cleared, apart from a vague description given by the neighbor of a man in his late 20s or early 30s, about 5'8", and wearing a check sports coat. During the next month, while Peter looked for work as a driver, Sonia decided to complete her teacher training and enrolled at the Margaret Macmillan College in Bradford. On Friday the 15th of August, Peter drove his friend, Trevor Birdsall, to Halifax, where they drank in some pubs. It was in one of these pubs that Peter had first seen Mrs. Olive Smelt. 46-year-old Olive had followed her usual Friday night pattern of meeting her girlfriends for a drink in Halifax, while her husband Harry stayed at home with their 15-year-old daughter Julie and 9-year-old son Stephen. Two men known well by the women gave them all a lift home. Olive was dropped in Boothtown Road, a short walk from her home. At the same time, Peter left Trevor alone in his car. As Olive took a shortcut through an alleyway at 11:45 p.m., Peter walked up behind her and overtook her. The last thing Olive could remember was Peter saying, "Weather's letting us down, isn't it?" before he dealt her a heavy blow to the back of her head. He hit her again as she fell to the ground, then slashed at her back with his knife just above her buttocks. He was again prevented from completing his task. A car was quickly approaching, so Peter left Olive and returned to the car where Trevor was waiting. A mere 10 minutes had passed. Olive could not recall how she came to be found some yards down the road, moaning and calling for help. Neighbors took her to their home, where they called an ambulance and sent someone to inform Harry. She was initially rushed to Halifax Infirmary and then to Leeds Infirmary, where she spent 10 days. Once again, Peter had left another woman's life in pieces. Olive would continue to suffer from severe depression and memory loss. For months, she would wish that she were dead as the repercussions of the attack took hold of her life. She was continually depressed and took no interest in her life. She lived in fear, especially of men, and would sometimes look at her husband and wonder, hadn't he been a police suspect? Their relationship was permanently altered, and she rarely felt like having sex. Her past enjoyment of homemaking and cooking was lost, and she now robotically completed these tasks. Her oldest daughter suffered a nervous breakdown, which doctors were sure was a direct result of the attack. And, for many years, her son would continue to lock the door whenever he left his mother alone in the house. Despite the similarities between the two apparently motiveless attacks upon Anna Rogulski and Olive Smelt, police would not link them for some time. It would be 3 years before they would confirm that the attacker was in fact the Yorkshire Ripper. On the 29th of September 1975, Peter Sutcliffe began working as a delivery driver for a tire company. Exactly 1 month later, he would succeed in killing his first victim, and his reign of terror would begin. Wilhelmina McCann, who preferred to be known as Wilma, was a fiery Scottish 28-year-old and a mother of 4. Her body was found on the morning of the 30th of October 1975, lying face upwards on a sloping grass embankment of the Prince Philip playing fields off Scott Hall Road, just 100 yards from her council home in nearby Scott Hall Avenue. Wilma had never settled into the mundane life of a wife and mother, much preferring the excitement of the nightlife in many Leeds hotels. On the night of her death, she had left her 4 children in the care of her oldest daughter, 9-year-old Sonia, to go out drinking. She was to drink heavily until closing time at 10:30 p.m. and then make her way home. Along the way, a lorry driver stopped when Wilma flagged him down, but continued on his way when he was greeted with a mixture of incoherent instructions and abuse, leaving her by the side of the road. She was seen at about 1:30 a.m. being picked up by a West Indian man, who was the second last person to see her alive. Soon after 5 a.m., a neighbor found Wilma's 2 oldest daughters huddled together at the bus stop. They were cold, confused, and frightened. Their mummy hadn't come home the night before, and they were waiting in the hope that she would come home by bus. Detective Chief Superintendent Dennis Hoban was in charge of the inquiry. When Professor Guy, the pathologist, completed his report, Hoban learned that Wilma had been struck twice on the back of the head and then stabbed in the neck, chest, and abdomen 15 times. There were traces of semen found on the back of her trousers and underpants. By the time the coroner's verdict of murder by person or persons unknown had been handed down, the 150 police officers that Hoban had working on the case had interviewed 7,000 householders and 6,000 lorry drivers. They had taken hundreds of statements from anyone with even the remotest connection to Wilma, each one painstakingly checked. But still, they had not even come close to finding her killer. On the 20th of November, 1975, 26-year-old Joan Harrison's dead body was found in a garage in Preston, Lancashire. She had been hit over the back of the head with the heel of a shoe and then kicked severely until she was dead. Before leaving her, the killer had dragged her to a more secluded part of the garage where he pulled her trousers back on and pulled her bra down to cover her breasts. Placing the boot he had removed earlier in between her thighs, he then removed her coat and covered her with it. He took her handbag and dumped it in a refuse bin after removing all of its contents. The killer was to leave some clues for the police. The first was a deep bite mark above her breast, which revealed that the killer had a gap between his front teeth. Tests on semen found in both her vagina and anus showed that the killer was what is known as a secretor, a person whose blood group information is secreted into their body fluids, approximately 80% of the population. The killer's blood group was of the rare B group. Initially, Joan Harrison's murder was not linked to Wilma McCann's, as there were too many differences in the killer's method. This decision would be altered when police were later to receive several letters from a man claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper. He mentioned the murder in Preston, leading the police to incorrectly believe that Joan Harrison was also one of the Yorkshire Ripper's victims. In reality, Peter Sutcliffe, the mysterious and elusive Yorkshire Ripper, did not claim another life until January 1976. Emily Monica Jackson, 42, lived with her husband and 3 children in Back Green, Cherwell, on the outskirts of Morley, west of Leeds. The Jacksons had been having financial problems for some time when Emily decided to begin taking money for sexual favors. Together, Emily and husband Sidney would drive their blue Cromer van into Leeds, where Sidney would wait for his wife in one of the bars, while Emily would use the van to earn the extra money they needed. On the night of Tuesday, the 20th of January, 1976, they parked their van in the car park of the Gaiety and went inside. They had a drink together. Then Emily left to see whom she could find outside. Sidney was to wait there until she returned at closing time. When she wasn't there to meet him, he took a taxi home, expecting her to follow in the van shortly after. But she never returned home. Emily's mutilated body was found just after 8 a.m. the following morning, only 800 yards from the Gaiety where her husband had waited for her. Peter Sutcliffe had left Emily lying on her back with her legs apart. She was still wearing her tights and pants, but her bra was pulled up, exposing her breasts. Like Wilma before her, Peter had struck Emily on the head twice with his hammer and then stabbed her lower neck, upper chest, and lower abdomen 51 times with a sharpened Phillips head screwdriver. Peter's need to vent his anger upon the already dead Emily caused him to make a slip. He stomped on Emily's right thigh, leaving the impression of the heavy-ribbed Wellington boot. The boot was further identified as a Dunlop Warwick, probably size 7, definitely no larger than an 8. Another print was found in the sand nearby. Hoban knew immediately that the man who had killed Emily Jackson was the same man that had killed Wilma McCann. Sidney Jackson, devastated by the vicious and senseless murder of his wife, believed that the man would kill again and prayed that he would soon be caught. He wept for his wife and sent their children to stay with relatives until he could tell them the terrible news of their mother's death. On March 5, 1976, Peter Sutcliffe was fired from his job with the tire company. Although he had been a good, hard worker, Peter was constantly late for work. His late-night forays into the red light districts of Yorkshire made it difficult for him to arise early enough for work. It would take him many months of rejection and frustration before he could find work as a lorry driver because of his lack of experience. In the same month, George Oldfield, Assistant Chief Constable at West Yorkshire Police Headquarters in Wakefield, received the first in a series of letters by a person claiming to be the Yorkshire Ripper. Oldfield quickly dismissed the letter, which claimed responsibility for the murder of Joan Harrison, but showed no relation to the Ripper case, as just another one of the many crank letters he, and many newspapers, had already received. As Marcella Claxton, a 20-year-old prostitute, walked home from a drinking party held by friends in Chapelton around 4 a.m. on the morning of the 9th of May, 1976, a large white car pulled up alongside her. She wasn't working that night, but she asked the driver for a lift. Instead of driving her home, he drove her to Soldiers Field, just off Roundhay Road. Peter offered Marcella £5 to get out of the car and undress for sex on the grass, but she refused the offer. As they both got out of the car, Marcella heard a thud as something Peter had dropped hit the ground. He told her it was his wallet. Marcella then went behind a tree to urinate. Peter walked towards her, and the next thing she felt was the blow of Peter's hammer as he brought it down upon the back of her head. Then she felt the second blow. She lay back on the grass, looking at the blood on her hand from where she had touched her head. Peter stood nearby. She remembered vividly that his hair and beard were black and crinkly, and that he was masturbating as he watched her bleeding on the ground. He went back to the white car with the red upholstery to get some tissues to clean himself up. When he finished, he threw the tissues on the ground and placed a £5 note in Marcella's hand, warning her not to call the police as he got back into his car. Marcella, her clothes now covered in blood, managed to half-walk, half-crawl to a nearby telephone box where she called for an ambulance. As she sat on the floor and waited for help, she could see Peter drive past many times looking for her, probably to finish the job and rid himself of a vital witness. The gaping wound in the back of her head required 52 stitches and a 7-day stay in the hospital. For months after the attack, she would hate men, barely able to even be in the same room with them. Even 5 years after the attack, she would still be plagued by depression and dizzy spells and be unable to hold down a job. The birth of her son Adrian coincided with Peter Sutcliffe's arrest in 1981, but neither event could ease the ache she had felt since her attack. She too wished she had died. The attacks of the Yorkshire Ripper were by now the main topic of conversation among prostitutes and the patrons of the many pubs in the Leeds area. With little information in the papers about the nature of the murders, the public soon added their own horrific details, which were incredibly similar to the notorious crimes of Jack the Ripper in the previous century. Prostitutes, in an attempt to protect themselves, were seen working in groups, making it very clear to their clients that the details of their car and registrations were being recorded. Increased police activity in the area put further pressure on the already strained relationship between the prostitutes and the officers of the law, creating a formidable barrier to police investigations. The fact that the attacks on Anna Rogulski and Olive Smelt had not yet been linked with the other Yorkshire Ripper murders resulted in complacency in the general population, who seemed to view prostitutes as somehow deserving of the Yorkshire Ripper's punishments. During the summer of 1976, George Oldfield promoted Dennis Hoban to the position of deputy head of the Force CID. While honored at the confidence shown in him by the appointment, he was disappointed that he would have to leave Leeds to work from the West Yorkshire Police Headquarters at Wakefield. Nor was he happy to be desk-bound in his new position. Detective Chief Superintendent Jim Hobson replaced Hoban. In October 1976, Peter Sutcliffe came home to his wife with the good news that he had finally found work as a lorry driver. He was now working with T&WH Clark Holdings Limited on the Canal Road Industrial Estate between Shipley and Bradford. It would be 5 months before Peter would kill again. Jim Hobson would head the investigation into this attack, like his predecessor Hoban had done 9 months earlier when Marcella Claxton had survived Peter's last attack. On Saturday, February the 5th, 28-year-old Irene Richardson left her rooming house in Copper Street, Chapeltown, at 11:30 p.m. to go to Tiffany's Club. At the time of her attack, Irene would have thought that life couldn't get any worse. Both of her daughters, aged 4 and 5, were with foster parents. She had nowhere decent to live, and due to lack of money, had to walk the streets of Chapeltown to look for customers. When Peter Sutcliffe had finished with Irene, he had left her lying face down in Soldiers Field, placing her coat over her inert and bloodied body. He had given her a massive fracture of the skull with the 3 blows he inflicted with his hammer. One of the blows had been so severe that a circular piece of her skull had penetrated her brain. He had stabbed her in the neck and throat, and 3 more times in the stomach, savage downward strokes so severe that they had caused her intestines to spill out. When Hobson and the pathologist, Professor Guy, removed her coat, they found that while her bra was still in place, her skirt had been lifted and her tights pulled off the right leg and down. One of the 2 pairs of pants she had been wearing had been removed and stuffed down her tights, while the other pair were still in place. Her calf-length brown boots had been removed and placed neatly over her thighs. A vaginal swab showed the presence of semen, but it was considered to have been from sexual activity before the attack. Near Irene's body, tire tracks were discovered and recorded. They indicated that the killer had used a medium-sized sedan or van. Checks with tire manufacturers established that the vehicle had been fitted with 2 India Auto-Way tires and a Nemant brand on the rear offside, all of them cross-ply. With the assistance of tire manufacturers, a list of 26 possible car models was drawn up. It seemed that a genuine break had finally been made in the investigation, but Hobson's elation would be short-lived. Police officers, without the benefits of computerization, had moved into local vehicle taxation offices each night to hand-check all the vehicles in West Yorkshire compatible with the list. The final tally was 100,000 cars. Patricia Atkinson was living alone again after her divorce from an Asian immigrant worker, Ray Mitra. After the birth of their 3 daughters, Judy, Jill, and Lisa, in quick succession, Ray would find his marriage to his wayward Western wife to be more than he could handle. Patricia, who preferred to be known as Tina, was happy with the new arrangement as she was now free to drink and dance as often as she pleased. She operated as a prostitute from her small flat at No. 9 Oak Avenue in Bradford, where she felt safe from the threat of the Ripper who killed his women outside. Being slim with dark hair and always smartly dressed, she had no shortage of male friends. On Saturday, the 23rd of April, she was seen by the caretaker of the building in which she lived, leaving her flat on her way to the busy red light pubs where she was well known for her heavy drinking. She was seen in a number of the pubs that night, and at 11 p.m., several women working on the street had seen her walking, heading toward Church Street. It was soon after this that Peter Sutcliffe had met the now well-intoxicated Tina. Together they walked to his car and then drove back to her flat. As they entered through her front door, Peter struck the back of her head with the same ball-peen hammer he had used on all of his previous victims. Before her unconscious body hit the floor, Peter struck her 3 more times. As the blood poured from her wounds, Peter began to remove her overcoat. He then lifted her and carried her to the bedroom and threw her down on the bed. There he ripped open her black leather jacket and blue shirt, pulling up her bra to reveal her breasts. He then pulled her jeans down to her ankles. With a chisel he had removed from his pocket, he began to stab at Tina's exposed stomach. He turned her over and stabbed her in the back, but had not penetrated the skin. Then he quickly turned her over again to stab her stomach again, leaving a total of 6 stab wounds. Before he left her, Peter had pulled her jeans back up and, without realizing it, he left a size 7 Dunlop Warwick Wellington boot print on the bottom bed sheet. As Peter's activities as the notorious Yorkshire Ripper continued to escalate, his wife Sonia was approaching the end of her teacher training. She was confident that she would pass before the coming summer. With the prospect of an increase in their income, Peter and Sonia began to see hope for the fulfillment of their dream to buy their own home. It would not be long before Sonia found the house of her dreams, No. 6 Garden Lane, Bradford. Peter was not so sure it was his dream home when Sonia told him that the asking price was over £15,000. It was a lot of money, and there was no guarantee that Sonia would get work straight away after the summer break, but he agreed to at least have a look at it. They went on a Saturday, the 25th of June, 1977. On the same night, Peter went to Chapeltown, supposedly for a drink. Jane MacDonald also went out that Saturday night. Jane was 16 years old and had recently started her first job in the shoe department of a local supermarket. She was going out dancing and she was happy. She kissed her father goodbye before she left their home in Reginald Terrace, Chapeltown, for the last time. After the dance, Jane had gone with friends to buy chips in the city centre. As she gossiped with her friends, the last bus home departed without her. At 11:50 p.m., she began walking home with Mark Jones, a young boy she had met earlier that night. He was to organize a lift home for her with his sister, but the sister wasn't home when they got there. Jane and Mark continued walking together, stopping for a brief kiss and cuddle, as far as the Florence Nightingale public house. It was 1:30 when they went their separate ways. At a kiosk near Dock Green Pub near the corner of Beckett Street, Jane stopped at 1:45 a.m. to call a taxi, but there was no answer. As she approached the playground, she did not see Peter Sutcliffe lurking in the shadows, waiting to pounce on her as she passed by. 2 children found her body at 9:45 a.m. on Sunday the 26th of June, near a wall inside the playground where Peter had dragged her. She was lying face down, her skirt was disarranged, and her white halter-neck top was pulled up to expose her breasts. Peter had struck her 3 times in the back of the head with his hammer and then stabbed her repeatedly in the chest and once in the back. From the moment Wilfred MacDonald, Jane's father, was told of his daughter's murder by the 2 uniformed police officers who had come to his door that Sunday morning, he lost the will to live. He soon developed nervous asthma and could not work. Instead, he would sit for hours at a time, thinking only of his daughter. It would take 2 years, but he finally died of a broken heart. Assistant Chief Constable George Oldfield was called soon after Jane's body was found. He would now be overseeing all of the investigations into the Yorkshire Ripper murders and would work in the field with the officers already involved in the case. Newspaper reports the following day, stating that an innocent young woman had been slaughtered, sadly reflected the underlying attitude of police and the public that prostitutes who are murdered are not innocent and somehow deserve whatever punishment is meted out to them. Police were now inundated with information from the public. People who once were interested only in hearing the gory details of the attacks now felt personally affronted and threatened by the man they called the Yorkshire Ripper. Where previously witnesses were reluctant to admit any connection with the murdered prostitutes, people from the surrounding area were readily volunteering information to help the police in their attempts to catch Jane's killer. Under the direction of Oldfield, police policy regarding the media was to become more open, working cooperatively to ensure that the public was kept informed of the facts that it needed while suppressing the release of information that would hinder police investigations. Oldfield personally visited members of every level of the community in an attempt to break down barriers to police-public cooperation. Officers involved in the investigation into the brutal murder of Jane MacDonald interviewed residents in 679 homes near the attack, over 13,000 interviews in total, with nearly 4,000 statements taken. Despite all of these efforts, Peter Sutcliffe was able to continue to hide behind his mask of respectability, and the Yorkshire Ripper continued his rampage. Even while the police worked feverishly gathering information about Jane MacDonald's murder, Peter Sutcliffe prepared to kill again. It was Saturday night, the 9th of July 1977, when Peter left Sonia at home in Tanton Crescent with her parents. Driving the white Corsair with a black roof, he headed for Manningham Lane and the red light Lum Lane district of Bradford. Maureen Long, at home in Falsey near Leeds, also made preparations to spend Saturday night in Bradford. She spent the first part of the evening visiting various pubs in Bradford, including one where she met her estranged husband and made arrangements to spend the night at his home in Leicesterdike, Bradford. The rest of the evening was spent at Tiffany's, in the Ballyhigh discotheque, where she danced and drank until just after 2 a.m. As she waited in the long queue at a nearby taxi rank to get a lift to her husband's home, a white car pulled up. The driver, Peter Sutcliffe, offered her a lift. Peter drove Maureen to Bowling Back Lane, where he struck her a massive blow to the back of the head. As she lay on the ground, he stabbed her in the abdomen and back. The barking of a dog nearby interrupted his frenzied attack, and he left Maureen for dead as he fled the scene. His car was seen leaving the area by a night watchman who was working nearby at 3:27 a.m. He described the car as a Ford Cortina Mark II, white with a black roof. 2 women living in a nearby caravan found Maureen the next morning. They had heard cries for help, went to investigate, and found Maureen Long lying seriously injured on the ground. She should have been dead. The injuries she sustained would have killed most people, but somehow Maureen survived. She was rushed to hospital in Bradford, where she underwent emergency surgery. Later, she was transferred to Leeds for major neurological surgery. Oldfield begged doctors for an opportunity to talk with Maureen before they commenced surgery. Maureen tried hard to recall as many details as she could. She remembered leaving Tiffany's and the car that had stopped to give her a lift. The man, as she recalled, was white with a large build, about 35, with light brown shoulder-length hair. He would have been about 6 foot, with puffed cheeks and big hands. She wasn't sure about the color of the car. It was white or yellow or blue. She would not remember anything when she came out of surgery. It would be 6 weeks before Maureen could leave the hospital, only to spend a further 3 weeks in a convalescent home before returning home. All she had to live on was her £13 a week Social Security payment. In 1978, she appeared in the Bradford Magistrates' Court, charged with stealing from 3 shops in the city centre. She told the court that she was waiting for compensation for the attack having only received £300. She was fined £75. In April 1979, the Criminal Compensation Board offered her £1,500. She appealed. She was later awarded £1,250 as an interim payment while her case would be held under medical review. To help make ends meet, Maureen sometimes received payments for interviews about the attack. While Maureen recuperated in the hospital, the police investigation began. Detectives set up interview rooms at Tiffany's nightclub in an attempt to glean as much information as they could from the patrons who had been there the week before. The investigation into the attack of Maureen Long would involve 304 officers working full-time. They interviewed 175,000 people, took 12,500 statements, and checked 10,000 vehicles. The night watchman's description of the killer's car as a white Ford Cortina Mark II matched the thousands of cars used by taxi drivers in the area. Police had already contemplated the possibility of the killer being a taxi driver. He would have a good knowledge of the area, enabling him to know the best haunts for prostitutes and the quiet, secluded areas that he could take them to. They had started questioning taxi drivers after Tina Atkinson's murder, and now they increased that line of investigation. Most were quickly cleared, but one taxi driver, Terry Hackshaw, was not. The police were not completely satisfied with his explanations about his whereabouts on the nights of the murders. He lived alone with his mother in a central location to all of the killings. He was 36 years old, and his appearance fitted the general description of the killer. Terry Hackshaw was placed under surveillance 24 hours a day. Police followed him as he drove his taxi and drank at local pubs. Armed with a search warrant, they entered his home, searching it from top to bottom, including dustbins and his uncle's tool shed. They removed all of his clothing from his home, cut locks from his hair, and took blood samples. They even took carpets from his car. He was taken in for questioning many times. On one such occasion, he was held from 8 o'clock in the evening until 8 o'clock the following morning. Meanwhile, the real killer continued to elude police and drove freely through the streets of Yorkshire, looking for his next quarry. For Peter and Sonia Sutcliffe, life was beginning to improve. On August 18, 1977, they had exchanged contracts for the purchase of their lovely new home, and Sonia began her first teaching position at Homefield First School in Bradford 2 weeks later. Then, on Monday the 26th, they moved into their home and Peter bought himself another second-hand Ford Corsair, a red one to replace the white Corsair he had sold on the 31st of August. The following Saturday, the 1st of August 1977, after spending the day working on his new car, he decided to take it out for a test drive. By 9:30 p.m., Jean Bernadette Jordan was climbing into the car with them near her home in Moss Side, Manchester. Jean, born in Scotland, had moved to Manchester after running away from home at the age of 16. She had met Alan Royal on the day of her arrival and moved in with him. 2 years later, they had their first child, Alan. 2 years after that, their second son, James, was born. Although they were still living together when she was murdered, they had mutually agreed to live separate lives. Earlier on in the evening of the 1st of October, as Jean poured Alan a glass of lemonade, he told her that he would be going out for the evening. He left her watching television, but she was gone when he returned later. He assumed that she had decided to go out with her girlfriends who were also on the game. Instead, she had taken Peter Sutcliffe to a quiet area of vacant land between allotments and the Southern Cemetery where she was to have sexual intercourse with him for £5. Before getting out of the car, she put the £5 note in a hidden compartment of her handbag. Once out of the car, Peter used his hammer to hit Jean over the head a total of 13 times. He then hit her body in undergrowth near the fence between the cemetery and the allotments. Peter, now fully recovered from the burst of frenzied anger, calmly drove home across the Pennines to Sonia and his new house and anxiously awaited the headlines that would announce his deed to the world. As he and Sonia planned the housewarming party to be held on Sunday evening, Peter began to worry about the £5 note he had given Jean. It was a brand new note, and it may be possible to trace it back to him. By Sunday the 9th of October, there still had been no word of the discovery of Jean's body in the papers. If he was at all troubled by the events of the week before, his party guests could not tell. It was almost midnight when Peter offered to take some of his relatives home in the red Corsair, while Sonia went to bed. After dropping his guests at their homes, Peter did not immediately return to Garden Lane. Instead, He drove over the Pennines once again. He found Jean's body exactly as he had left it, but her handbag was missing. As he searched the area, he began frantic at the prospect of the police finding the £5 note. When his frustration and fury were at their peak, he dragged the lifeless and already rotting body away from its hiding place. He tore Jean's clothes from her body and then stabbed her over and over again. 18 times he stabbed at her breasts, chest, stomach, and vagina. There were fierce slashing swipes, some 8 inches deep. One extended from her left shoulder down to her right knee. When the rage subsided, he thought again of the £5 note and attempted to cut off Jean's head. He intended to divert police attention by disposing of her head somewhere else. When he realized that it was an impossible task with the tools he had, he gave up and went home. It hadn't occurred to Alan to report Jean as missing. She had often just taken off from home without notice to visit relatives in Scotland, so he assumed that it was the same this time and that Jean would turn up in her own good time. It wasn't until he read the report in the paper on the evening of the 10th of October that he became concerned. The report described the young woman, who had been found by a neighbor at midday, as having shoulder-length auburn hair and listed some of the clothing found. What the police didn't say was that her blackened head was unrecognizable. It had been flattened with the severity of the many blows she had received. Her belly was gaping open, and putrefaction was evident. At the Manchester CID headquarters, Alan showed Detective Chief Superintendent Jack Ridgway a recent photo of Jean, but Ridgway couldn't tell if it was the same woman that he had seen earlier that day. Reluctant to subject Alan to the same sight of Jean's mutilated body, Ridgway suggested that there might be something in the house that would have Jean's fingerprints on it. Alan immediately remembered the lemonade bottle that was still sitting where Jean had placed it over a week before. The prints on the bottle were a definite match with those of the corpse. A friend of Jean's, Anna Holt, had also gone to the police after reading the report in the paper. She insisted on seeing the body and positively identified her as Jean Jordan. Anna told police that Jean had only recently decided to give up the game and settle down with Alan and the children to lead a decent home life. Alan was devastated by the tragedy and would lose his job as a chef because he found it impossible to concentrate on his work. Thoughts of Jean and how she died would constantly torment him. Their son Alan, considered a bright boy before his mother's murder, was retarded by the trauma of the ensuing months. By his 5th year, he was still only able to speak a few monosyllabic words. On Saturday the 15th of October, Jean Jordan's handbag was found only 100 yards from where her body had lain the week before. The money that Alan believed she'd been carrying was missing, but in a hidden pocket at the front of the bag, police found a £5 Bank of England note. The note, with the serial number AW51121565, was brand new, issued only a couple of days before Jean was killed. The Bank of England established that the note was part of a consignment sent to the Shipley and Bingley branches of the Midland Bank, right in the heart of the Yorkshire Ripper area. Ridgway was confident that the Yorkshire Ripper could be found if they could trace the owner of the £5 note. With this aim in mind, Ridgway, along with 30 hand-picked Manchester officers, travelled to Bradford and opened a special incident room at the Baildon School. It was quickly established that the note in question had been part of a bundle of £500 and had been the 5th last note in a sequence of 65. Ridgway's excitement soon abated when he learned that the note had been part of a batch of £17,500, which had been distributed to several firms in the Bradford and Shipley area that employed almost 8,000 men in total. It would take Ridgway and his men 3 months to interview 5,000 of those men. One of the firms they had concentrated on was T&WH Clark Holdings Limited in Canal Road, Shipley. Just before Christmas, they interviewed the men that worked there, including Peter William Sutcliffe of Garden Lane, Heaton. There had been nothing about Peter or the other 5,000 men that had seemed suspicious. They had even spoken to his wife Sonia, who had not contradicted in any way Peter's account of the nights they'd asked him about. Even as the police were interviewing those 8,000 men, one of them, the Yorkshire Ripper, struck again. But this time, he would leave his victim to provide a strong identification of him and his car. It had started on the 14th of December, when Marilyn Moore left a friend's home in Gathorne Terrace near the Gaiety pub at 8 p.m. As she walked along Gipton Avenue towards her home, she noticed a dark-colored car drive slowly toward her. Sure that the driver was a potential client, she began to walk to Leopold Street, where she assumed his car would next appear. Her assumption proved correct when she found his car parked near a junction known as Franklin Place. The driver was leaning against the driver's door. He was about 30, with a stocky build, about 5 foot 6 inches tall, with dark, wavy hair and a beard. He was wearing a yellow shirt, a navy blue or black zip-up anorak, and blue jeans, and appeared to be waving to someone in a nearby house. He asked her if she was doing business, and they set a price before she got into the car with him. As he drove her to a vacant lot in Scott Hall Street, about a mile and a half away, he told her that his name was Dave and that the person he had been waving to was his girlfriend. When they arrived at their destination, Dave suggested that they have sex in the back seat, but when Marilyn got out of the car, she found that the back door was locked. As Dave came behind her to open the door, Marilyn felt a searing, sickening blow on the top of her head. She screamed and attempted to protect her head with her hands. As she fell to the ground, frantically grabbing her attacker's trousers as she fell, she felt further blows before losing consciousness. A dog barked at the sound of Marilyn's screams, and Dave left before he could finish the job. Marilyn remembered hearing him walk back to his car and slam the door, and then she heard the back wheels skid as he hurriedly drove away. Slowly, Marilyn managed to get herself to her feet and stumbled towards a telephone. Before she could, a man and woman, noticing the blood running from her head, stopped to help and called an ambulance. She was rushed to Leeds General Infirmary for an emergency operation. She would stay there until just before New Year's Eve, but it would be a long time before she could face returning to Leeds. Back in Leeds again, where she returned to work as a prostitute, she continued to suffer from depression. She still has a hole in the back of her head and scars all over her scalp. There is no doubt in the minds of the investigators that Marilyn was another of the Yorkshire Ripper's victims. This was confirmed when the tire tracks left by his car were found to match those at the site of Irene Richardson's death. Despite this new evidence, the hunt for the Ripper continued without success until the third week of January 1978, when Ridgway pulled his team out of Bradford, knowing that they had probably met the killer and failed to recognize him. By the end of January 1978, police were beginning to wonder whether the Ripper had been scared off by his unsuccessful attack on Marilyn Moore. What they did not know at the time was that he had in fact killed again on the night of January 21st, but the severely mutilated body of Yvonne Pearson would not be found until the end of March. Any hopes police may have had were soon put to an end in the first week in February, when another of the Yorkshire Ripper's victims was found. Helen and Rita Ritka were the twin daughters of an Italian mother and Jamaican father. At the age of 18, when Helen was killed, they lived together in a miserable room next to a motorway flyover in Huddersfield. Although they both worked as prostitutes, they had dreams of a much better life in the future. In the meantime, they would continue to work the streets of the Huddersfield red light district as a pair. To ensure each other's safety, Helen and Rita agreed that they would always take the car number of every client and meet back at an appointed time after 20 minutes, a system which had worked well for them until the snowy night of Tuesday, the 31st of January, 1978. Helen came back to the rendezvous point 5 minutes earlier than Rita at 9:25 p.m. The opportunity to make an extra £5 before her sister returned was too good to miss, so Helen got into the car with Peter Sutcliffe. They drove to Garrett's timber yard near the railway, a common haunt of prostitutes and their clients. Peter convinced her to get into the back seat, and as she did so, Peter struck her with the hammer. He missed and hit the car door instead, alerting Helen to the danger she was in. But before she had a chance to scream, he had hit her again. She immediately crumpled to the ground. It was then that Peter realized they were in full view of two taxi drivers who stood talking nearby. Taking Helen by the hair, he dragged her to the back of the woodyard. Still alive, Helen vainly attempted to protect herself from the hammer as Peter crashed it down onto her head again. Scared that the taxi drivers would discover them, Peter lay on top of Helen and covered her mouth with his hand, then had sex with her as she lay bleeding. Finally, the taxi drivers left, and Peter got up to find his hammer, which he had dropped. While he searched, Helen attempted to escape. As she ran from him, Peter hit her several more times on the back of the head. Still alive, Helen was dragged to the front of the car where Peter stabbed her through the heart and lungs with a kitchen knife he had hidden in his car. Rita arrived back at the rendezvous point only 5 minutes after Helen had driven to her death. After waiting for some time in the cold, she gave up and went home, assuming that Helen would be waiting for her there. Fear of the police prevented her from reporting Helen's disappearance until Thursday. On Friday, the 3rd of February, a police Alsatian dog located Helen's body where Peter Sutcliffe had left her on the previous Tuesday. On the 10th of March 1978, George Oldfield received another letter in which the writer claimed to be the Yorkshire Ripper. Although it was postmarked as being sent from Sunderland, the murder of Joan Harrison was again mentioned, and he promised that the next victim would be old. Uncertainty about the validity of the letter increased when the body of Yvonne Pearson was found on the 26th of March 1978. If the letter had been from the murderer, why did he not mention Yvonne's murder, which had occurred 2 months earlier, a fact that only the murderer could have known, unless, of course, the Ripper had not killed Yvonne. She had been found on wasteland off Lum Lane in Bradford by a passerby who had noticed her arm sticking out from under an old sofa that had been dumped there long ago. The fact that she had been bludgeoned with a large blunt instrument, presumed to have been a rock, caused police to wonder. This was not the Ripper's usual method, but many of the other characteristics of this murder were similar to the other deaths. Yvonne Pearson had left her 2 girls, aged 2 years and 5 months, in the care of a babysitter on the night of the 21st of January 1978 to see if she could earn some money. Her first stop that night had been the Flying Dutchman pub, where she was seen leaving at 9:30 p.m. Soon after that, Peter Sutcliffe invited her to get into his car to do some business. At the murder site, he hit her repeatedly on the head with a lump hammer. When she was dead, he hid her body under the sofa and jumped on her chest until her ribs had broken. Fear of discovery by people in the area had cut short his time with Yvonne, and he had not stabbed her. A newspaper, dated 1 month after her death, was placed under her body, leading police to believe that the killer had returned to the scene of the crime. It would be another 2 months before Peter Sutcliffe would kill again. His next victim was 41-year-old Vera Millward, an older woman, just as the letter from the man calling himself the Yorkshire Ripper had promised. Vera Millward, a Spanish-born mother of 7, had been living with her Jamaican boyfriend, Cy Burkett, in their flat at Greenham Avenue, Holmes, at the time of her death. Vera had been very ill after an operation, the 3rd in as many years. She left her home on Tuesday the 16th of May to buy some cigarettes and pick up some painkillers from the nearby hospital. Sometime after purchasing her cigarettes, she met Peter Sutcliffe. On the grounds of the Manchester Royal Infirmary, in a well-lit area, Peter Sutcliffe struck Vera on the head 3 times. Then, undressing her in his usual manner, he slashed her so viciously across her stomach that her intestines spilled out. He also stabbed her repeatedly in the one wound on her back, just below her lower left ribs, and punctured her right eyelid, bruising her eye. Her screams for help were heard and ignored by a man and his son entering the hospital at the time of her attack. People in this area were well accustomed to such cries in the night. When he had finished with her, Peter dragged her body 12 feet away and dumped her by a chain-link fence on a rubbish pile in a corner of a car park. She was found at 8 a.m. the following morning, lying on her right side, face down with her arms folded beneath her and her legs straight. Peter had placed her shoes neatly on her body. Tire tracks were found nearby. They matched those left at the murder site of Irene Richardson and at the site where Marilyn Moore had been attacked. The pathologist's report revealed that there had been traces of mineral oil used in engineering shops in Josephine Whittaker's wounds. It was soon confirmed that the particles were similar to those found on one of the envelopes of the mysterious letters from Sunderland. The letters were seen as credible evidence that could lead toward the capture of the elusive Yorkshire Ripper. On the 16th of April, George Oldfield announced that the now daily press conference would be held at 3:30 p.m. instead of 10:30 a.m. The press was ready for the announcement of an important breakthrough in the case. The police had already sent a team of 4 detectives to Sunderland who had begun visiting firms in the area to gather details of Geordies who had been to Yorkshire on the dates of the attacks. At the press conference, Oldfield announced the Geordie connection and asked firms in the West Yorkshire area to check their records of employees who had been sent to Sunderland during March 1978 and March 1979. 2 months later, When Oldfield received a cassette tape from the writer of the letters, the police would be sent on a wild goose chase as they searched for the killer with a Geordie accent. While police officials debated whether or not to go public with the tape, news of its arrival and contents were leaked to the press. The decision was made, and a press conference, at which the tape was played, was called on Tuesday the 26th of June, 1979. The public response was enormous, with 50,000 calls received by police, putting further strain on the already understaffed West Yorkshire force. The incident room at Sunderland had to be expanded to 100 officers. By the end of the second day, they had received 1,000 calls, and every lead was followed up. And officers were still busy in August when Mr. Stanley Ellis, a Leeds University voice expert, announced that the voice on the tape was from a village in Castletown. A team of police officers was moved to Castletown, where interviews were carried out in every home, but to no avail. The men who were found to match the voice had alibis for the dates of the attacks. Thus, the natural conclusion should have been that the person who wrote the letters and sent the tape was not the Yorkshire Ripper. Instead, the police continued to propagate the belief in the minds of the public that the Yorkshire Ripper had a Geordie accent. The strain of the investigation had taken its toll on George Oldfield, who suffered 3 heart attacks and was hospitalized at the end of July. He would not return to the investigation until the beginning of 1980. By the end of August 1979, many officials were beginning to question the validity of the Geordie connection. The extent of the search for the writer of the letters would have been successful by now if he had been the killer. The discrepancies in the details in the letters and the fact that the surviving victims had not recognized the voice on the tape were all valid reasons, in the minds of more and more of the police investigators, to dismiss the letters and tape altogether. On the night of the 1st of September 1979, Barbara Janine Leach went to the Manville Arms with 5 of her closest friends. Barbara was a student at Bradford University and lived with a group of students in a house in Grove Terrace, just across Great Horton Road from the university. She had decided not to go home to Kettering, where her parents, Beryl and David Leach, lived, so she could continue studying before the beginning of her 3rd year of a Bachelor of Science degree. She had rung her mother earlier that day to wish her father a happy birthday and apologized for not sending him a card. She told her mother that she would be heading home on Monday to spend the week with them. Also at the Manville Arms that night was Peter Sutcliffe. He had seen Barbara from across the other side of the room and had watched her continuously. At closing time, 11 p.m., he left and waited in his car outside. Barbara, along with her 5 friends, had stayed behind to help clean up and have a drink with the landlord, Roy Evans. When they finally left at 12:45 a.m., Peter was watching nearby as the group walked towards Great Horton Road. As they were about to turn left into Grove Terrace, Barbara decided to go for a walk and invited her friend, Paul Smith, to join her. When he declined the offer, she asked him to wait up for her as she didn't have a key. He agreed, and they parted company. As he watched Barbara walk down Great Horton Road alone, Peter started the car and drove down Back Ash Grove, where he parked the car. With hammer and knife in hand, he got out of the car and walked quickly along the alleyway, knowing that Barbara would soon be walking past at the other end. He waited for her in the shadows of Ash Grove, listening to the echo of her boots on the pavement as she walked towards him. As she passed, he sprang, smashing the hammer into her head. It only took the one blow, and she was dead. Quickly, he dragged her lifeless body back into the shadows of the side entrance toward Back Ash Grove. In the yard behind number 13, he dropped her body and tore at her clothing, exposing her breasts, abdomen, and underpants. He stabbed her 8 times, then dragged her body near some rubbish bins and covered her with a piece of old carpet which lay nearby. Paul Smith waited for Barbara for over an hour. Then, assuming that she had decided to join one of the many parties being held all over the area, went to bed. When she hadn't come home the next morning, he rang her parents and the police. A search began that same day, and her body was found that afternoon. Professor Guy, the pathologist who had worked on all of the Yorkshire Ripper cases, believed that the knife used to stab Barbara was the same one used on Josephine Whittaker. With the deaths of 2 victims that were not prostitutes in non-red light areas in 6 months, the West Yorkshire public was now interested in more than just gruesome stories about the Yorkshire Ripper. They wanted action. Why weren't the police doing something to stop this killer who had dared to threaten the lives of decent women? Police investigations were stepped up, and a £1 million publicity campaign was launched involving newspaper advertising and the posting of billboards, reminding the public of the killer with the Geordie accent. By now, few people would have ever suspected a bearded lorry driver with a Yorkshire accent living in Bradford, only a 5-minute drive away from police headquarters. On Thursday, the 13th of September, West Yorkshire Police issued a confidential 18-page report to all other forces. It outlined the 16 known Ripper attacks and was intended to help police in the elimination of suspects, along with detailed descriptions of all the evidence on the case, including the letters and the transcript of the tape. There was a 5-point list to be used for elimination. It stated that any suspects could be eliminated if the man was not born between 1924 and 1959, only those between 20 and 55 years of age need to be considered. The man was obviously a colored person. His shoe size was 9 or over. His blood group was other than B. And, most crucially, his accent was dissimilar to a Northern Eastern or Geordie accent. The report then described the 3 most common events in all of the known cases as being the use of 2 weapons, a sharp instrument and an alleged 1¼ ball-peen hammer, the absence of sexual interference, and the clothing moved to expose breasts and pubic region. Officers in every region were asked to report any similar attacks in their areas, whether fatal or not. Another important change in police procedure involved the use of a new computer program through the Police National Computer. By entering the makes and the registration numbers of vehicles cited in the areas of the attacks, the computer could chart precise flow patterns of individual vehicles. It was hoped that witness information of a particular car type in the area of an attack could be matched with vehicle registration numbers recorded in the area, and then cross-checked against other records. Through this process, they were able to eliminate 200,000 vehicles, including that which was driven by a lorry driver in Heaton who lived and worked in the area. While the use of the computer enabled police to check and cross-check information at enormous speed, saving thousands of man-hours, it also created an avalanche of new information that had to be checked. By the beginning of 1980, the police were faced with millions of facts, 5 million in the case of car registrations alone, and they were now swamped, barely able to keep up with the demand. Since January 1979, when Jack Ridgway and his men had left Bradford in their search of the owner of the £5 note found in Jean Jordan's handbag, they had returned many times to interview employees of firms like Clark's, where Peter Sutcliffe lived. Peter had been interviewed on some occasions, and his workmates had taken to calling him the Ripper because of the apparent police interest in him. Even as late as 1980, Peter was never considered to be a strong suspect, even though he had a gap in his front teeth, his car had been spotted in red light districts several times, his blood type was of the B group, but not a secretor, he had the right boot size, and his name was on the now dramatically shortened list of 300 possible recipients of the £5 note. Inexplicably, none of the men interviewed at this time were given blood tests, nor were any men placed under surveillance or boot sizes checked. The overwhelming reason why Peter Sutcliffe was not considered a suspect, even after a total of 9 interviews with police, was that he had provided alibis verified by Sonia, and because he did not have a Geordie accent. A frightening indication of how greatly assumptions can prejudice an investigation such as this, limiting the outlook of the investigating officers to the point that they can miss vital clues. In April 1979, Peter Sutcliffe had admitted to his workmates that he was having an affair with a young woman in a village near Glasgow, taking them all completely by surprise. He was the last person they would have ever expected to fool around. He had always talked of his marriage to Sonia in happy terms and never talked about women sexually at all. He had met Teresa Douglas at the Crown Bar in Holytown, 12 miles from Glasgow, when he made a delivery to the nearby General Motors plant. He returned regularly to the village and quickly won the hearts of Teresa and her family. Known to them as Peter Logan from Yorkshire, they considered him to be one of the nicest men they had ever met. He told the family that he lived alone in a large house in Yorkshire, had been married but was now divorced. He spent many hours talking with Teresa and had at one time admitted to her that he had a potency problem and could not have children. He wrote romantic letters to Teresa and gave her his father's address so Sonia would not find out. He had made such a good impression on Teresa and her family that they all laughed when he told them that he was the Yorkshire Ripper after Teresa's brother William said his eyes looked evil. In April 1980, a year since he had met Teresa, Peter Sutcliffe was faced with the prospect of losing his license and his job. There would be no more visits to Glasgow to see his girlfriend and no more nights cruising the streets of Yorkshire looking for prey. He had been out drinking and had decided while on his way home to make a detour through Manningham, a careless move considering the amount he had had to drink. Police, who noticed him driving erratically, stopped him. He was breathalyzed and then arrested. Soon he would have to go to court and would probably lose his license. He was nervous for a far more important reason than this. What if the arresting police were to find that he had been interviewed many times in the Yorkshire Ripper investigations? Would he be revealed as the killer, wanted in what had become known as the criminal investigation of the century, all because of a lousy drunk driving charge? It wouldn't happen this time. There were no cross-checks done, and he was soon free to go home. If the prospect of losing his license bothered him, he didn't show it. He told workmates that he and Sonia planned to move to the country and open a pottery business. They would use the proceeds from the sale of their house to finance the project, as Sonia was a talented potter and they could make a decent living. Sonia, although concerned about the drop in income, looked forward to having her husband home with her at night. It had been a lonely life with Peter working late and spending regular nights at pubs with his friends. As Peter waited for his impending court appearance, due in January 1981, he attacked 4 women, killing 2 of them. His first attack occurred in the respectable suburb of Farsley, Leeds. His 47-year-old victim, Marguerite Walls, was a civil servant who worked at the Department of Education and Science at Farsley. She worked late on the night of the 20th of August 1980, as she had wanted to clear her desk before she started her vacation the next day. She left her office building at 10:30 p.m. to begin the short walk home, taking the longest but safest route along well-lit streets. In New Street, as she walked past the entrance to a local magistrate's house, Peter Sutcliffe jumped out from behind the fence where he had waited for her and hit her on the head with his hammer. Marguerite did not fall to the ground as Peter expected her to. Instead, she began to scream, and a second blow to the head still did not stop her screaming as she held her now bleeding head. To stop her screaming, he grabbed her by the neck and strangled her. As he did so, he dragged her into the driveway and through the overgrown bushes of the property called Claremont. By the time he reached the garage, deep in the garden, Marguerite was dead. He ripped at her clothes, tearing them from her and scattering them around the garden. His anger and frustration at his failure to bring his knife rose with him and could not be quelled as he rained blows on her body with his hammer. Before leaving her, he covered her body with leaves that had been left in a pile nearby. As he left the garden, he checked that the street was quiet before stepping out from the darkness. 15 minutes later, he was safely home. When Marguerite was found the next morning, only 400 yards from her home, it was soon determined that, although she had been bludgeoned with a hammer, her strangulation ruled her out as a victim of the notorious Yorkshire Ripper. Headingley, home of one of the world's best cricket fields where World Series Test cricket matches are played, was not the type of town anyone would have expected the Yorkshire Ripper to strike. There were no red light districts. It was a suburb where students, teachers, and media people chose to live for its cosmopolitan atmosphere. But it was here that Peter Sutcliffe attacked Dr. Apadya Bandera, visiting Leeds from her native Singapore as part of a World Health Organization scholarship. It was the 24th of September when Dr. Bandera made the long walk home after visiting friends in Headingley. As she walked past the Kentucky Fried Chicken shop, she noticed a man inside. He was staring at her. She walked on past North Lane and then turned right onto St. Michael's Lane. As she turned into Chapel Lane, an alley that cuts through to Cardigan Road, she was hurled to the ground. Peter Sutcliffe slammed his hammer into her head, rendering her unconscious. He held her around the neck with a ligature to prevent her escape. Apadya Bandera lay bleeding on the ground as Peter picked up her shoes and handbag and took them several yards away. Before he could resume his attack, he heard footsteps and fled. The footsteps belonged to Mrs. Valerie Nicholas, whose house backed onto the laneway. She had heard noises at 10:30 p.m. and had gone out to investigate. The police in Headingley did not believe that the Yorkshire Ripper had attacked Dr. Apadya Bandera, even though she described her attacker as having black hair, a full beard, and a mustache. Dr. Bandara returned to Singapore to recover. Peter Sutcliffe's next attack, on the 5th of January 1980 in Huddersfield, was also credited to an unknown attacker. Teresa Sykes, a 16-year-old who lived with her boyfriend and their 3-month-old son, had been walking home across grassland not far from her home when Peter rained 3 hammer blows to her head. He had followed her from the Minstrel pub where she had dropped in to see her father, the owner, before he struck her from behind, with one of the blows so severe that it went through her skull. Teresa screamed as Peter struck her. Her boyfriend, Jimmy Fury, watched in horror from their lounge room window. Within seconds, he was running toward Teresa and Peter. When Peter saw Jimmy, he ran back into the darkness of the night. Teresa miraculously survived the brutal attack, but she was never the same again. After spending several weeks in the neurosurgical unit at Pindersfield Hospital in Wakefield, Teresa returned home, but early in 1981, she left Jimmy and returned to live with her parents. Teresa was now afraid of men, and, despite their plans to marry, she was even afraid of Jimmy. Her father, who always believed that the Yorkshire Ripper had been responsible for his daughter's attack, said that since the attack, her whole personality had changed. Where she was once a happy girl, she was now quick to flare up in anger over the smallest thing. Peter Sutcliffe had left his mark on yet another family. On the night of November 17, 1980, Sonia resigned herself to yet another night alone watching television. Peter had called to tell her that he was still in Gloucester, making a delivery, and would not be home until late. What she would not find out until much later was that Peter was not working at all. He had clocked off from Clark's at 7:03 p.m. and headed for Headingley, where he had spent another evening only a couple of weeks earlier. He again ate at the Kentucky Fried Chicken shop. As he stood looking out of the window at 9:23 p.m., Jacqueline Hill alighted from the number 1 bus at the stop opposite the Arndale Shopping Arcade. She was returning home after attending a seminar on the probation service in Cookridge Street, Leeds. Jacqueline was a student at the university who had hoped to join the probation service when she graduated the following summer. Peter Sutcliffe began to follow Jacqueline after she passed the Kentucky Fried Chicken shop. He was behind her as she entered the dimly lit Alma Road toward the Lupton Flats where she had recently moved. Her mother had been concerned about her living alone on the outskirts of town because of the Yorkshire Ripper attacks. So Jacqueline had decided to move to the all-girl flats in Lupton Court, which was part of a complex of university residences behind the Arndale Shopping Centre. Jacqueline was only 100 yards from her home when Peter Sutcliffe struck her on the back of the head. He dragged the lifeless body of Jacqueline Hill 14 yards into some vacant land just behind the Arndale Shops car park. Protected from view by trees and bushes, Peter stabbed her repeatedly. He stabbed her in the eye that had stared up at him accusingly as he tore at her clothes and slashed her naked body. When he had finished, he left her and headed for home. He forgot that Jacqueline's handbag and glasses still lay on the pavement in Alma Road where she had dropped them. Only a short time after the attack, Amir Hussain, an Iranian student, found the bag as he walked home to Lupton Court. He took it home with him and showed it to his 5 flatmates, one of whom was an ex-chief inspector with the Hong Kong police, Tony Gosden. Tony became alarmed when he saw that nothing had been stolen from the bag and noticed fresh blood spots on the outside of it. At 11:30 p.m., one of the students called the police, but it was some time before the 2 investigating officers arrived at the flat. It was only at the insistence of Mr. Hussain that the police finally agreed to search the area where he found the bag. The brief search by torchlight did not uncover Jacqueline's body, and the police left. A worker at the Arndale Shops discovered Jacqueline the next morning at 10:10 a.m. She was lying less than 30 yards from where the police had searched the previous night. Initially, police denied that the Yorkshire Ripper had struck again until Professor David Gee announced his findings. The Ripper had struck again for what the police wrongly believed to be the first time in 14 months. The attack was widely publicized, with police requesting the assistance of anyone who had been in the area that night. They were especially interested in talking to the owner of a dark, square-shaped car which had been seen reversing hurriedly down one-way Alma Road. The driver, understandably, did not come forward. With Jacqueline's murder, the real threat of the Yorkshire Ripper was finally brought home to Britain's middle class. No longer was he just killing prostitutes in the seedy parts of town. So-called innocent women were now acutely aware of the danger to themselves, a danger that prostitutes had been living with for nearly 5 years. The feminists of Britain, who had previously complained about the police and media referring to non-prostitute victims as innocent, were suddenly angry at the death of one of their own. They took to the streets in a violent protest against their loss of the right to walk their streets safely. The police were inundated with information from the public. Police in Leeds received 8,000 letters, 7,000 of which were anonymous. Most named suspects. One of those unsigned letters was from Trevor Birdsall. In it, he named Peter Sutcliffe, a lorry driver from Bradford. When police still did not question Peter 2 weeks later, Trevor entered the Bradford Police Headquarters, where he repeated his allegations to the constable at the reception desk. The report was fed into the system, and Peter Sutcliffe continued to walk free. Trevor had been suspicious of Peter for some time before he went to the police, even as far back as Olive Smelt's attack. But Peter was his friend whom he didn't think was capable of killing. The police insisted that the Yorkshire Ripper was from Sunderland and spoke with a Geordie accent, which had allayed Trevor's suspicions for a long time. When Trevor heard nothing more from the police, he assumed that they had followed up with Peter, and he had been wrong. The task force responsible for the investigation into the Yorkshire Ripper murders was not aware of Trevor Birdsall's letter or his report. They had long been buried under the mountain of information that had been accumulated over the past 5 years. Since Jacqueline Hill's attack, George Oldfield was no longer in charge of the investigation. Jim Hobson had replaced him. Hobson delivered a full-page message to the force in the December issue of the West Yorkshire Police newspaper. In this message, he asked that all police officers work toward the arrest of the Yorkshire Ripper, committing them to a plan of daily action towards such an outcome. His statement that, although the Yorkshire Ripper probably had a Geordie accent, police should not eliminate a possible suspect on those grounds, was to prove a vital influence in the arrest of Peter Sutcliffe in January 1981. Also in mid-December, Peter Sutcliffe made a trip to Sheffield, an area he had not before visited during his work as a long-distance lorry driver. He had gone to the remote depot on the moor north of Sheffield to make a delivery. It should have been a short visit, but the Christmas rush had caused a backlog, and Peter had spent most of the day there. The depot manager remembered him well because, unlike most of the lorry drivers he knew, Peter had been softly spoken and well-mannered. He did not swear or cuss when told of the delays. He merely passed the time chatting to some of the workers in the busy factory. It would be remembered later that he had asked about an area of vacant land close to Sheffield, which could be clearly seen from the heights of the depot. Peter noted how quiet it was in Sheffield. Peter had been so impressed by Sheffield that he returned there again 2 weeks later, on Friday the 2nd of January 1981. But this time he was not driving his lorry, and the delivery he intended to make was with his hammer on some woman's head. He left home for the last time at 4 p.m. that afternoon. 24-year-old Olivia Reivers had left her 2 children, Louise, 5, and DeRoy, 3, at home at 6 o'clock to meet up with her girlfriend Denise Hall, 19, to earn some money from passing punters in Sheffield's red light district. It was only 9 p.m., only moments after the 2 young women had started patrolling along Warncliffe Road, when Denise met her first potential client. He was driving a Browne Rover 3500 and had pulled up to the curb, but there had been something about his eyes that had disturbed her. Despite his good looks, with a neatly trimmed beard and dark wavy hair, he had frightened her, so she declined his offer of £10. An hour later, the same Rover pulled up to the curb again. When Olivia looked into Peter's eyes, she did not see what her friend Denise saw. Taking him up on his offer of £10, Olivia climbed into the car. They drove a short distance to Melbourne Avenue and parked in the driveway of the British Iron and Steel Producers Association headquarters. Olivia had often brought her customers up here where it was quiet and isolated, perfect for business. Peter Sutcliffe had been unable to become aroused, despite Olivia's many attempts, so they had sat and talked for a while, mostly about Peter. In his pocket were his ball-peen hammer, a piece of rope, and a knife. He was just waiting for an opportunity to get the woman outside. While he waited, Sergeant Robert Ring and Constable Robert Hines were driving along Melbourne Road as part of their general patrol. When they saw the dark Rover parked in the driveway, they had a pretty good idea why. They pulled in behind the Rover and questioned the couple sitting in the car. He said his name was Peter Williams. The dusky woman said she was his girlfriend. Luckily for Olivia, Ring remembered her face, certain that she was a convicted prostitute with a suspended sentence. He told her to get into the police car. Peter Williams told them he needed to go to the toilet and walked further along the dark driveway. Near the entrance to the building, there was an oil storage tank. It was behind this tank, well out of view of the policeman, that Peter placed his hammer and knife. He hoped they hadn't heard the sound they had made as he placed them on the ground near the wall. As Peter made his way back to his car, Ring and Hydes had called into the station for a check on Peter's car registration number. Within seconds, the operator at the end of the line had got the information they were looking for through a direct link to the National Police computer at Hendon. The registration number on the Browne Rover parked in front of them belonged to a Skoda. Both officers got out of the car and checked the plates on Peter's car, which were held on with black tape. When they checked, they learned the license number was FHY 400K. Peter confirmed this and admitted that his real name was Peter William Sutcliffe, and he lived at Garden Lane, Heaton, Bradford. He had lied because he didn't want his wife to find out that he'd been with a prostitute. Back at the police station in Hamerton Road, Olivia and Peter were placed in separate interview rooms. Peter had told them that he had stolen the plates from a car in a scrapyard in Cooper Bridge, which meant that Peter would have to be transferred to another jurisdiction just as soon as they found out where Cooper Bridge was. After many calls, they found that Cooper Bridge fell under the jurisdiction of Dewsbury Police Headquarters. They were told an officer would be there in the morning at 6 a.m. when Ring and Hydes finished their shift. Sonia was called and told that her husband wouldn't be home that night, and Peter was placed in a cell to sleep the night. Before retiring, Peter asked permission to go to the toilet. While he was there, he placed a second knife in the cistern. As the three officers from West Yorkshire drove towards Sheffield, an officer from the Dewsbury station rang the incident room in Millgarth, the base for the Yorkshire Ripper inquiry. It was a routine call made because of a recent directive from Hobson to all West Yorkshire police that any man found with prostitutes in suspicious circumstances was to be reported to the task force. At 8:55, Peter Sutcliffe arrived at Dewsbury Police Station with the West Yorkshire Police, where he was transferred into the station's interview room. Just after 9 a.m., Sonia called and was told that her husband was being interviewed about the theft of car number plates. In the interview room, Peter Sutcliffe chatted with officers about his work as a lorry driver and his love of cars. They noted that he had dark, frizzy hair, a beard, and a gap between his teeth. The officers were familiar with the 5 points of reference for the elimination of suspects in the Yorkshire Ripper case, but were not fazed by the lack of a Geordie accent. Peter Sutcliffe lived in Bradford in the heart of Ripper country, and had told them that he had driven to Sunderland many times in his work as a lorry driver. The list of possible cars could not include the Browne Rover that Peter was driving at the time of his arrest, but Peter had told them about his white Corsair with a black roof. While being questioned by a detective, it was learned that police had questioned Peter Sutcliffe on many other occasions about the Yorkshire Ripper case. He wore a size 8 shoe, maybe even a 7. Detective Sergeant Des O'Boyle, an officer of the task force and well-versed with the Yorkshire Ripper case, had left for Dewsbury at lunchtime on Saturday the 6th of November to question Sutcliffe himself. During the interview, a blood test revealed that Peter Sutcliffe was of the rare B group. By 6 p.m. that night, while not convinced that Peter Sutcliffe was the Yorkshire Ripper, O'Boyle called into the Millgarth incident room and told a senior officer, Detective Inspector John Boyle, that he would not be clocking off but would stay with the case. At 10 p.m., Sutcliffe was locked in his cell and had gone to bed. When Sergeant Ring returned to Hamerton Road Police Station to begin his 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. shift, he was told that Sutcliffe was still being held at Dewsbury Station and being questioned by Yorkshire Ripper squad officers. Ring would then make a decision that would have a momentous impact on the Yorkshire Ripper investigation. Sutcliffe had left his car to go to the toilet. Maybe he had left something at the scene. He recalled hearing a clinking noise. Ring returned to the driveway on Melbourne Avenue to have a look around. When he shone his torch on the ground by the wall behind the oil storage tank, Ring found the ball-peen hammer and knife that Peter had cautiously left there the night before. A detective superintendent at Sheffield made a call to Detective Superintendent Dick Holland at his home in Elland, near Huddersfield. Holland quickly suppressed the initial excitement he had felt when he was told that it looked like they may have finally caught the infamous Ripper. If it was their man, he wanted to be sure that they did everything right. Holland issued John Boyle with some instructions on how to proceed with the investigation and requested that he be briefed at 9 a.m. the following morning at Bradford Police Headquarters. At 9:30 on Sunday, the 4th of January, Dick Holland, Sergeant O'Boyle, Detective Chief Inspector George Smith, and Detective Constable Jenny Crawford Browne arrived at number 6 Garden Lane, where Sonia Sutcliffe told them that they could search the house. At 10 a.m. they left, taking with them several tools, which included ball-peen hammers, and Sonia Sutcliffe, and returned to Bradford Police Headquarters, where police questioned Sonia extensively for 13 hours. Dick Holland had sent Detective Sergeant Peter Smith of the Regional Crime Squad, who had been involved in the Ripper case longer than almost anyone else, to question Sutcliffe in Dewsbury. Throughout the morning, the investigating officers, without overtly mentioning the Ripper attacks, gleaned as many details of Sutcliffe's movements at the times of the attacks as possible. At the same time, officers behind the scenes were working to gain as much information about Peter Sutcliffe's movements over the past 5 years as they could, including visits to past employers and making other inquiries in the Bradford area. By early Sunday afternoon, Peter was beginning to lose the incredible calmness that he had shown throughout the 48-hour ordeal. The police were now sure that they had the right man. When questioned about his movements on the night of Teresa Sykes's attack on the 5th of November 1980, Sutcliffe told them that he was positive that he had arrived home by 8 p.m. Sonia's recollection was different. She distinctly remembered Peter arriving home at 10 p.m. Although no longer officially in charge of the investigation, George Oldfield was called and told of the news. He quickly made his way to Dewsbury, where he was joined shortly afterward by other senior officers from the task force. At 2:40 p.m., Peter Sutcliffe was told about the discovery of the hammer and knife. As they continued to question him about the attack on Teresa Sykes, it was then that Peter Sutcliffe sat back in his chair and calmly admitted that he was the Yorkshire Ripper. The killer's mask had finally been removed, and the most known unknown man was revealed. Over the next 26 hours, Peter Sutcliffe, calmly and with little display of emotion, told police officers the gruesome details of the last 5 years of death and mutilation. The only emotion he showed was when discussing the murder of 16-year-old Jane MacDonald, and when police questioned him regarding the murder of Joan Harrison, which he strongly denied. After his confession, Peter Sutcliffe had one request of George Oldfield. He wanted to be the one to tell his wife, Sonia. She was immediately driven from Bradford Police Headquarters to the Dewsbury station, where George Oldfield met her before being taken to the interview room to see her husband. Sutfield sat at a small table across from Sonia as he calmly told her the shocking story. When Sonia emerged from the interview room, she appeared to be calm, not revealing what emotions she may have had hidden below the surface. Police would continue to question her about her husband's movements during the past 5 years, since the attack on Anna Rogulski in 1975. After Sutcliffe's initial statement had been recorded, a press conference was called. 80 journalists packed the small room in which Ronald Gregory, George Oldfield, and Jim Hobson sat smiling at the cameras while announcing that they believed they had finally caught the Yorkshire Ripper. The elation the police felt was reflected by the abandonment of established procedures in dealing with the press in such a situation. Although Sutcliffe's name was not stated, many details not normally revealed, usually omitted to protect a suspect's defense, were revealed to the public. On Monday the 5th of January, when Peter Sutcliffe appeared in the magistrate's court in Dewsbury, the question that had plagued the British public for the past 5 years was answered. Everyone now knew the identity of the Yorkshire Ripper. The question as to why he had killed 13 women and left 7 more so brutalized that they would wish they too had died was answered on Tuesday the 6th of January. Peter Sutcliffe told police that in 1967, at the age of 20, he had heard the voice of God speak to him as he worked at Bingley Cemetery. He would claim that he had first heard that voice while digging a grave. He stated that the voice had led him to a cross-shaped headstone upon which were written the Polish words Hego, Webi, and Echo. It was the same voice that had ordered him to kill prostitutes. Police officials were satisfied that Peter Sutcliffe was mentally ill, suffering from paranoid schizophrenia, and should be incarcerated in an institution for the insane. Mr. Justice Borum was not as sure as the police, the psychiatrists, the prosecution, and Sutcliffe's defense counsel. They had made their conclusions purely based on what Sutcliffe had told them. It seemed very likely that Sutcliffe could be lying. Sutcliffe had been overheard telling his wife that he might be able to reduce his sentence to as little as 10 years if he could convince everyone that he was mad. Borum informed the Attorney General, Sir Michael Havers, of his decision that Peter Sutcliffe should go to trial before a jury of 12 members of the public. They would decide whether Peter Sutcliffe was mad or guilty of the crime of murder. The trial would last 14 days, and it would take the 6 men and 6 women of the jury 6 hours to make their decision. As the deliberations of any jury in a murder case, there was much discussion. But unlike in any other case, this jury did not discuss whether or not Peter William Sutcliffe had committed the crime of murder. It was the responsibility of this jury to determine the true mental state of Peter Sutcliffe. The prosecution had put before them the possibility that Sutcliffe had been lying when he told police about the voice of God, which had ordered him to kill. The defense, with the help of many psychiatrists, had attempted to prove that the story was true. On Friday, the 22nd of May, 1981, Peter Sutcliffe stood before the jury as the jury foreman declared the decision that Peter William Sutcliffe was guilty of 13 counts of murder. 10 of these 12 men and women believed that Peter William Sutcliffe was not insane, but was an evil and sadistic murderer. 5 years of terror and pain for so many women, their parents, relatives, friends, and their 36 children came to a sudden end when Peter William Sutcliffe, the notorious Yorkshire Ripper, was led away from the dock, showing no emotion, to begin his sentence of life imprisonment. Justice appeared to be served, but the scars would never heal for those who had survived the carnage wrought by the hand of one man. In December 2015, Sutcliffe was assessed as being no longer mentally ill. In August 2016, a medical tribunal ruled that he no longer required clinical treatment for his mental condition and could be returned to prison. Sutcliffe was reported to have been transferred from Broadmoor to HM Prison Frankland in Durham, County Durham, in August 2016. Sutcliffe died at University Hospital of North Durham, aged 74, on the 13th of November 2020, after having previously returned to HMP Frankland following treatment for a suspected heart attack at the same hospital 2 weeks prior. He had many underlying health problems, including diabetes, and had refused treatment for COVID-19. A private funeral ceremony was held, and Sutcliffe's body was cremated.
Robert Charles Browne, serving time for rape and murder in Colorado, made headlines once again in July 2006 when he claimed to have killed 48 other people, which, if true, would make him America's most prolific known serial killer. However, there were skeptics. When his total proved to surpass by 1 the record set a couple of years before by Green River killer Gary Ridgway, Browne's confession provoked skepticism. Was he telling the truth, or just seeking attention by one-upping the current king of the hill? The truth can be difficult to establish, especially given the events that led up to his unexpected revelation. In 1995, Browne pleaded guilty to the 1991 murder in Colorado of 13-year-old Heather Dawn Church. 5 years later, he initiated a correspondence of cryptic notes to Texas prosecutors that suggested more victims. The score is you 1, the other team 48. He dropped a few clues, but seemed to want them to figure it out. A cold case squad got involved, and eventually Browne declared he'd been killing since 1970 in 9 different states. On a crude map, he showed 17 in Louisiana, 9 in Colorado, 7 in Texas, 5 in Arkansas, 3 in Mississippi, 2 in New Mexico, 2 in Oklahoma, 2 in California, and 1 in Washington state. He'd used a knife, a screwdriver, an ice pick, and just his hands. He dumped victims everywhere, in lakes, rivers, and gullies. Some he'd even cut up. Even so, confessing and corroborating one's claims are 2 different things. And if Browne is exaggerating, he wouldn't be the first. Claiming higher numbers of victims, especially from prison, has become a regular pastime for serial killers since the late 1980s. To consider the motives Browne might have for such exaggerated claims, we need to lay out a bit of history, both his and that of prison culture. It began with the disappearance of young Heather Dawn Church. While evidently not Browne's first victim, this was the one that stopped him. Mike and Diane Church moved to a remote piece of property outside Colorado Springs in Ebert, Colorado. A person would have had to have gone well out of his way to find their home and abduct one of their children. So it seems fairly clear at once this was a local crime. Heather, 13, was one of 4 siblings, and she enjoyed playing outside. Responsible and studious, she gave her parents no cause to worry. She was even enrolled in a program for gifted students. Eventually, Mike and Diane separated, and Mike moved into an apartment. That left Diane alone with the kids at the remote homestead, but she said she did not feel unsafe there. Nevertheless, when the separation came to look like divorce, the house went on the market. Her neighbor up the road was Robert Charles Browne, 38, living in a trailer with his 5th wife on property used for a tree nursery. Diane didn't know them, but apparently Browne had grown aware of her, or at least of her home. On September 17, 1991, Diane's world caved in. She had taken 2 of her boys to a Boy Scout meeting that evening at the local Mormon church, leaving Heather to babysit her 5-year-old brother. Diane called at 8:30 p.m. to make sure everything was okay, meaning to tell Heather to close a window in the master bedroom she'd seen open, but she forgot. When Diane returned after the meeting, she noticed that the house was dark and a sliding door unlocked. At first, these details didn't alarm her, but to her shock, Heather was not in her room or anywhere else in the house. Diane called every one of whom she could think, including Mike, but no one knew where the girl could be. She called the sheriff's office, and someone came right over, but a search and rescue crew could not be sent out until daylight. The crew combed through the woods and knocked at every neighbor's door. Diane remembered the open window in the master bedroom. They examined the window's bent screen, which appeared to have been forced, and a latent fingerprint examiner dusted for prints. She managed to identify and lift a good one, so that if they found the person who'd bent the frame, they could make a match. Searchers came onto Browne's property, and, while he was helpful, he refused access to a specific building, saying it was securely locked. They accepted that. The authorities believed they were looking for a wandering child, not a potential kidnap victim, and Browne seemed quiet and unassuming, just another neighbor. There was no reason to suspect him. Many people were questioned, and the lifted print was sent to the Colorado Bureau of Investigation, as well as to the FBI, but no match turned up from their computer databases of convicted offenders. At the time, though, this type of search was limited. The databases from all the states had not yet been hooked into the automated fingerprint identification system, so if a match had come in from another state, the chance of identifying him with this print was low. Heather wasn't found in the initial searches, and it was 2 years before someone chanced across her remains. Along Lower Rampart Range Road, where other homicide victims had been recovered from time to time, a scrap metal collector found a human skull. The still intact set of teeth identified it at once as the remains of Heather Dawn Church. Her body had been dumped about 30 miles from her home. The hope for her safe return one day had been dashed for good. To identify the perpetrator of this crime, the difficulty lay in gathering evidence. 2 years after the kidnapping, retrieving a skull from among a heap of junk meant there would be little, if anything, in the way of trace evidence. By this time, many men had been questioned as suspects, including Mike Church. Fathers are always initial suspects in the abduction of a child, especially during a period of separation, but no one had been implicated. America's Most Wanted had devoted part of an episode to the case without producing fruitful leads. Yet even the discovery that the girl had been killed and her body dumped nearby failed to advance the investigation, so the case went cold. In 1995, Lou Smith, who would later become famous as an independent investigator in the John Bennett Ramsey case, was a captain of the county's detective force. He set to work on the case file, creating a timeline and looking for possible clues that others had missed. He re-interviewed certain people and looked at the burglaries in the area at the time. He also checked and rechecked alibis. It was painstaking work, but he was known for his persistence. This was often the way a good detective broke cases that others had given up as a lost cause. A lab worker suggested rerunning the lone fingerprint. It was always possible that the perpetrator had been picked up for another offense, and his print was now in the automated system. Some cold case cops ran unmatched prints every day for years, on the hope that finally, on this day, the perpetrator had been arrested on some other charge. This kind of dogged devotion had paid off several times, helping to generate more interest in other cold cases. Smith made up a package with a blown-up image of the print to send out to 52 jurisdictions. 2 months later, in March, he received good news from Louisiana, a match to a man convicted for burglary and car theft in that state. The man they were looking for lived within half a mile of the churches, Robert Charles Browne. It was disheartening to have been that close to the perpetrator, even to have searched his property, and yet to have missed him. But nonetheless, he was still there. Despite his protests of innocence, detectives brought Browne in for questioning. First, they wanted to know if he'd ever done work on the church's home, to eliminate this possible reason why his fingerprint would be at the scene. He denied it. When he learned about their evidence, he insisted they run the print again. He was certain it was a mistake. But the print was good, and it was his. At his arraignment, he pleaded not guilty. The investigators had little else, and they knew a case for kidnap and murder would be difficult to make, but they got to work looking into his background. To their surprise, 2 months later, Browne changed his plea to guilty. According to his story, he had entered the home through a window, and Heather had surprised him. He strangled her there in the house and took her body out to dump it in a remote location. For this murder, he received life in prison. Smith believed Browne had made this unexpected admission because investigators were looking into the disappearance of another woman. She'd been his neighbor in Louisiana, and, if extradited to face trial for her death, he could face the death penalty. Since he was now behind bars, there seemed little reason to continue to investigate, especially outside their jurisdiction. It was Browne himself who revived interest, but 5 years later. Once more, it took the work of cold case detectives to open it up. Many cold case squads were formed during the 1990s as a result of a drop in the number of violent crimes. Since 1960, as the U.S. murder rate had steadily risen, police departments had added personnel. The increase in violent crime was accompanied by a higher percentage of stranger homicides, the most difficult to solve and the most demanding of resources. It seemed that things would only get worse, but in the middle of the 1990s, the murder rate declined. Police departments now had surplus resources, and they could return to older cases to give them more attention. With dramatic new developments in forensic science and technology, especially DNA analysis and more extensive computer databases, the solution to some cold cases looked imminent. A new breed of detectives trained in these scientific resources and technologies took to the field and began working out how to put these advances to work for investigative purposes. They also cared a lot about solving these older crimes. Over the past decade, the cold case units around the country had cleared hundreds of backlogged cases, putting offenders behind bars who'd believed they'd escaped detection. In addition, many innocent people who did not belong in prison were exonerated and freed. But these investigators can't take on every cold case. To prioritize, case selection involves consideration of various solvable factors: former witnesses ready to talk, a new suspect, or new technology not tried before. Key evidence must be preserved and available for testing. Biological evidence can be tested for DNA profiles, and fingerprints can be entered into databases that receive more new prints every day. Cold case detectives have access to the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime, the U.S. Marshals Service, military investigative services, organized groups of retired professionals, and crime investigation volunteer groups that offer unique services. The science of cold cases involves more than just the latest technologies available for solving older, unsolved cases. It's also about historic incidents and inventions that have helped to develop specific areas of a relevant discipline like ballistics or toxicology, or have gained ground in court for an increasingly sophisticated approach to crime investigation. Among these cold case squads was the one in the Colorado Springs area that focused on Browne, Lou Smith, now retired, Charlie Hess, former FBI and CIA, and Scott Fisher, a crime photographer and retired publisher. They were dubbed the Apple Dumpling Gang. Smith and Hess met weekly to discuss unsolved crime, and Hess took up correspondences with convicted felons to see if he could get more out of them. One of them was Charles Robert Browne, but only after Browne had already reached out. In 2000, Browne began dropping hints. He sent a letter to El Paso County prosecutors, writing, "The score is you 1, the other team 48. This seemed to have been inspired by the Zodiac messages in which an unknown killer in San Francisco in the late 1960s taunted police with his score versus theirs. Among other things, Browne also wrote, "7 sacred virgins, entombed side by side, those less worthy, are scattered wide. If you were to drive to the end zone in a white Trans Am, the score could be 9-48. That would complete your home court sphere." Again, it sounds like he was reading a book about the Zodiac and trying to copy his style. Smith was already aware that 2 women were missing from Browne's hometown of Coushatta, Louisiana, both from an apartment complex where he had worked as a handyman. Hess began correspondence, and he and Browne played a cat-and-mouse game for about 4 years before the effort paid off, but only after promises and a few gifts. They were finally able to solve the murder of young Rocio Sperry, only 15. Detectives set to work on the Grand Am Lady. Hess got Browne to provide more details, including that the woman had been an Army wife who had once lived in Florida. From her, he'd taken a specific type of ring which he described. He also pinpointed the apartment complex and said that the victim had lived at either Unit 107, 108, or 109. They got a list of Pontiac Grand Ams and Trans Ams registered in Colorado between January 1987 and December 1988. There were 172. This was further narrowed down until they located a Grand Am owner named Joseph Sperry. He had lived near Pikes Peak during the right time period. He'd served in the Army, and his apartment number was correct, 109. His wife at the time had vanished in November 1987. Her name was Rocio, and she'd had a ring like Browne had described. Joe had been away, and upon his return, he found her gone and her clothes piled into garbage bags. A 10-inch length of her hair, cut off while still in a ponytail, lay on a dresser. And while his television was gone, her purse was still there. He called the police, but became an immediate suspect. It was he, not the police, who found the car abandoned, but he could not get them to process it. Unfortunately, a clerk had mistakenly written that Rocio had been found, so the evidence had been tossed. That made corroboration difficult, but most of the circumstances matched what Browne had finally described. Once the victim was identified, although her body was never found, he pleaded guilty and received a second life sentence. Of the 48 supposed murders, Browne had provided information in 19, and even with those, much of his accounts were vague. He had been considered a viable suspect in only 7 more, but in these he'd provided solid details. Of the 9 supposed victims in Colorado, he'd supplied information in only 2 cases. The first person he said he had killed was male, a soldier in South Korea in 1970. That case could not be verified. There were several unsolved homicides in the areas Browne claimed as his killing ground, and many families hoped for closure about their missing or murdered loved ones. Detectives in different jurisdictions investigated their case files to try to determine if Browne could be their man. They understood he might have read news accounts about their victims and could then report names, dates, and other items to falsely link him, if he so chose. They knew well enough to be careful not to feed him more. One potential victim was Catherine Jean Hayes, whose remains had been discovered in Wynn Parish, Louisiana, in 1981, 6 months after she disappeared from a restaurant. Another woman, Wanda Hudson, had been murdered in 1983 in her apartment, where Browne had worked as a handyman. He said he'd attacked her with a screwdriver. Faye Self had gone missing from the same apartment complex in 1983. Browne claimed he killed her in her apartment and then took her body out to the Red River, dumping it. He made the same claim about another woman from Louisiana, unnamed because the authorities were unable to corroborate it. Browne's details were too vague. The same was reported about a few other cases that Browne claimed. During interviews, he was unable to give sufficient detail to assist significantly. More than one officer expressed reservations about Browne's grandiose claims, but Browne frequently clammed up and refused to say any more. He was the one in the driver's seat. Browne wrote a letter in 2002 in which he hinted that he might have kidnapped someone to hold her in a concealed chamber, but then he had been incarcerated. Since he could not get to her to feed her, she presumably died. Would he then be held responsible? If so, then 3 should be added to the 9. He followed this with a letter the year after in which he stated he did not know why he was writing these letters. "I'm trying to get my affairs in order," he wrote. "To do so, I need to contact many sources of which I don't even know who they are." He mentioned that the sanitation companies do a great job of disposal and claimed that no one ever got away, never gave the opportunity. If you're going to do it, just do it. He stated that he found women untrustworthy and that what generally triggered a murder was disgust with a person. He viewed women as cheating whores and users, although it was never made clear why he had taken such a dim view. As months passed without much progress, many people began to question whether Browne was the killer he claimed, or more of a con man. It would seem to defy reason to confess to something one did not do, especially murder. But some ambitions override reason. Notoriety, for example, gamesmanship, leverage for better conditions, and even self-aggrandizement. Let's consider similar cases. H. Holmes was convicted in Philadelphia in 1896 for an insurance fraud that involved murder. He insisted he was innocent, but for $10,000, proclaimed himself the world's most notorious killer, claiming 100 victims before reducing that number to 27. The newspaper wanted a sensation, he whined, and before mounting the gallows, he pared his confession to only 2. The truth was probably somewhere in between. During the 1980s, coverage of serial killers became its own industry, inspiring groupies, wannabes, and entrepreneurs who created trading cards and sold serial killer memorabilia. Serial killers became cultural anti-heroes. In a wound culture, where people openly displayed their physical and psychological scars on talk shows, some serial killers were cast as the ultimate in traumatized children lashing back, and many were willing to play this to the hilt. For television cameras, these killers spoke about their lack of self-esteem, their abuse, and their unrestrained compulsions to erase the lives of others in order to feel alive themselves. After killing a 10-year-old child, Donald Leroy Evans, 34, a self-described white supremacist, confessed to more than 60 murders in several different states since 1977. He was finally convicted of only 2 murders, and he recanted his extravagant confession. Donald Harvey, a male nurse, claimed over 80 murders before making plea deals in 37 of the cases. And when the police arrested Glenn Rogers in 1995 in connection with 5 murders, he took credit for 70, including those of Nicole Brown Simpson and Ronald Goldman. Then he said he was only joking. He was convicted in 2. Pee Wee Gaskins told his story to an author, claiming that he'd killed more than 100 people, mostly women. And while he was certainly prolific, many of these murders were unverified by the time he was executed. Claudine Eggers, 78, became pen pal to Joseph Fisher, in prison for the murder of a 16-year-old boy. He was paroled in 1978 and moved in with Eggers in her New York home. She financed his cross-country trip on which he killed several people, including her. But after being caught, he pursued the distinction of being the most notorious serial killer. Initially, he said he had decided on 26, but had accomplished only 19. Various murders from around the country were attributed to him, and soon his total went over 30. However, he was only tried for the murder of Eggers, for which he was convicted of second-degree murder. He then granted interviews to the media, including tabloid-style talk shows, and soon his claimed victim total was up to 150. He thrived on the notoriety. Many believed him, but it would not be long before another killer made law enforcement officers realize how easily they could be duped. The most infamous confessor was Henry Lee Lucas, arrested in 1983. This one-eyed drifter estimated he'd killed 100 people, but eventually raised that number to 360 in 27 different states. In an unprecedented event, lawmen filled an auditorium in the hope of closing their open cases. But then, Lucas recanted. No one knew quite what to make of a killer confessing to so many crimes he did not do, but then he insisted that he'd been forced to recant. His persistent waffling reduced his credibility. While it was clear that he had committed 4 murders, including his mother, even one of those, a female victim dubbed Orange Socks, came into doubt. Some criminologists believed he was responsible for between 40 to 50 murders, but no one knows for sure. But we do know that during his confessions, Lucas got extra special treatment, nice meals, a comfortable cell, and plenty of attention. He was having a ball. "I set out to break and corrupt any law enforcement officer I could get," Lucas said later. "I think I did a pretty good job." He received the death penalty for Orange Socks, but this sentence was commuted to life, and he eventually died in prison in 2001 of natural causes. The truth, if it remained anywhere, went with him. Dr. Stephen Egger, associate professor of criminology at the University of Houston Clear Lake, and the author of The Killers Among Us, an examination of serial murder and its investigation, once interviewed Lucas. He experienced firsthand the challenge of interpreting such confessions. "It was difficult to tell when Lucas was lying," Egger admits. "In some cases, I might ask him to talk about an average killing, and it seemed to me that what he said came from his imagination. He just thought it up." He was convicted of 11 homicides, so he was a serial killer, but he did blow a lot of what I call smoke and mirrors and played a lot of games. Egger advocates verifying whatever serial killers say, one case at a time. Most of them are psychopaths, and they're good at lying. I don't place a lot of stock in my interviews with them. It appears that Browne might have studied Lucas as well as the Zodiac. None of these men had any remorse for their murders or their lies. They're not made for it. Among the most dangerous features of psychopathy are a callous disregard for the rights of others and a propensity for violating norms. They might not necessarily become outright criminals, let alone killers, but the likelihood of exploitive and deceptive behavior is high. Without remorse, psychopaths charm and manipulate others for their own gain. They lack a sense of responsibility, and they con others with no regard for the feelings of others. In fact, they don't see others as fully human as themselves. Those with low inhibitions against violence may kill. Psychopaths are suffering from a personality disorder, not a mental illness, that involves traits such as narcissism, impulsivity, and callousness. From brain scan studies, it appears that they fail to process the emotional content of situations, such as empathy, concern, or alarm. Those who commit crimes have proven more brutal than other criminals, more aggressive, and more diverse in their activities. They also represent a high percentage of repeat offenders. They're resistant to therapy and intolerant of frustration. It doesn't matter whom they hurt. What matters is that they get what they can for themselves. Because they don't have what people need for living in social harmony, some psychologists refer to them as unfinished souls. Robert R. Hare, a renowned expert on the disorder and author of Without Conscience, says there are indications that the personality structure and propensity for unethical behavior is shared by both criminal and non-criminal psychopaths, and they may be as common as 1 in every 100 people. Psychopathy, Hare believes, touches virtually every one of us. For the most part, when they do offend, their crimes are cold-blooded. With those who are serial killers, there appears to be a strong tendency towards sadism. They find victims easily because they're glib, charming, and predatory, while their victims are generally naive. They dispense with anyone without a thought for the suffering of either the victim or their families. Thus, there's no reason to believe that they'll tell the truth whether under oath or not. It's not easy to know when to trust someone who has already exploited trust as a route to torture, rape, and murder. Psychopathic killers knew their victims as objects, useful only as pawns in their own personal game, and they thus have this advantage: they feel no remorse. They're callous, manipulative, and resistant to therapy, and when they choose to communicate, they have their own agendas, formed in self-interest and calculation. What we may accept as a confession, they may view as bait. Their motives take shape within a framework that has no equivalent in the normal world. That's why we can't just accept what they say at face value. A special agent from the FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit interviewed Gary Ridgway, who had initially confessed to 71 before settling on the official toll of 48. She had this to say: "I can't think of any behavior on its own merit that would indicate that someone is telling the truth or exaggerating. It's not that I wouldn't believe them, but I'd like to get basic verification first. In my opinion, many of these people have an egotistical need to control and manipulate, and some like to be bigger and badder than the other guy." She points out that not only might they lie to exaggerate or dupe investigators, but paradoxically, they might also conceal murders they committed. They don't want anyone to know about their early, feeble, halting attempts or the mistakes they made. If they lose a potential victim, they claim they intended to. It's hazardous to be gullible, especially for investigators hoping to close a case. They might inadvertently reveal details, allowing offenders to play them for fools. As well, they may expend limited resources. However, there are hazards in dismissing these offenders too, notably that they may stop providing details that can solve crimes. The bottom line is this: even skilled investigators may not spot a clever liar with a selfish agenda. Detecting deception takes time, patience, a bit of sleuthing, and the corroboration of facts. Above all, it requires the ability to avoid a rush to judgment that may result in mistakes, such as those made with Lucas. While psychopaths appear to use the same language as normal individuals, they have their own inner logic. They calculate the world around them in terms of self-gain. They are society's vampires. They may be intoxicated rather than repulsed by the idea of targeting humans and picking them off because it makes them feel powerful. Their agendas have no analogues in the normal world. That means developing a careful mode of communication. In this person's perception, almost any response could be the wrong one. Former FBI profilers John Douglas and Greg McCrary have conducted prison interviews with psychopaths such as John Wayne Gacy, who killed 33 young men and buried them under his house, and Mark Hoffman, a brilliant forger who tried to escape debt by killing people with bombs. These criminals have no sense of the damage they've caused. To urge them to express regret is pointless. They might do so, but only as a manipulative tactic. There are three important things to keep in mind when talking with psychopaths: clear goals, firm boundaries, and awareness of their triggers. In other words, keep your purpose in such communications up front, while also watching for the psychopath's manipulative tactics, charm, deception, deal-making, and for what will keep him or her talking as opposed to shutting down. It's tricky, and getting it right generally requires extensive exposure to the person. No matter how many letters Hess or others write to a killer like Browne, only those who have lived with him on a daily basis know him well, and even they can be fooled. Browne was the son of a sheriff's deputy and brother to a former state trooper. His was a family that cared about public safety and the law. However, Browne developed differently. He was the youngest of 9 children in Coushatta, Louisiana, dropping out of high school to go into the Army. In 1976, he was dishonorably discharged for using drugs. If he's telling the truth about one of his murders, he used a position as handyman at an apartment complex owned by his brother to kill at least one of the tenants. He had no shame or sense of family loyalty. The fourth of his 5 ex-wives, Rita Morgan, gave an interview to the Charlotte Observer, providing details about the kind of man Browne is. For one thing, he often flew into rages and made frightening threats. He would tell her how easy it would be to kill her with no one the wiser. Yet when he had wooed her before they were married, he'd been compassionate, even doting. This behavior is called compartmentalization, something psychopaths are good at. They morph into whatever they need to be to gain their ends. And once they have it, they let their true personalities show. Before, he held the car door open for her, wrote one reporter about Rita. After, he smashed her to the floor for a misplaced set of keys. Most of his marriages lasted 3 years or less, and several wives alleged abuse. Rita said she'd had no inkling of what Browne might be like. They met when he was on leave from the service, and she was just a teenager. They took up a brief correspondence, and when they encountered each other a few years later, she had married and divorced another man. He began to show up where she worked as a waitress, and finally, they went out. He came with flowers. They got married, and within a week, Browne had become a bully. He was already yelling at her that he could kill her. She was stunned. But then he apologized and assured her this behavior would not be repeated. He lied. Almost anything could set him off, and he seemed to go into a trance before he started beating her. He believed he could treat his wife like property. He once put a gun to her head and pulled the trigger, but the gun was unloaded. He also choked her once so badly she had to go to the hospital. But once he asked her to shoot him, as if he knew he was bad and he wanted someone to kill him. He said he knew he had a problem, but when she got him to a clinic, a psychiatrist was so confrontational it ended any hope she had of intervention. Browne was furious. Another woman with whom Browne was involved said he enjoyed thinking of himself as a master, with her the slave, and that he watched a lot of pornography. His final wife filed for divorce and went into therapy for victimization issues. She was reportedly afraid of him. A year after Browne's startling confession, a reporter for the Shreveport Times decided to check in on what was happening with the investigation. While authorities were reviewing the claims he'd made, several deputies had expressed disappointment. Investigators in 4 states had dropped their investigations altogether or ruled Browne out as a viable suspect. In Washington, investigators had searched in vain for evidence of a woman killed at a scenic overlook between Spokane and Seattle. While 3 murders in Louisiana appeared to match details Browne provided, he'd not been charged. In fact, as of July 2007, no new charges had been filed since those for the murder of Rocio Sperry. One promising case involves Nydia Mendoza, who was murdered in 1984. She was a dancer in Houston, Texas, and was seen leaving one night with 3 men. Her body was found 4 days later. The case went cold until Browne's confession. He described a young woman like Nydia and apparently provided details that had not been made public. At the time, he had been driving a white van to make silk flower deliveries. He claimed to have accompanied her from the club, taken her to a motel for sex, and strangled her. He then supposedly dismembered and beheaded her, taking the parts away in a suitcase. He dumped them off a highway exactly where they were found. He might be good for 6 murders, perhaps even the 9 he'd once suggested, but that's as far as authorities have come in making a case. In many ways, it doesn't matter. He's in prison for life. But it does matter to the families who want to know that the person who killed their loved one has been caught and is being punished. Hess declines to say whether Browne opened up because he wants to clear his conscience. It's a common belief that the guilty suffer and need to get their guilt off their chests. That's not true, however, for psychopath. Browne grants information, it seems, when there's something to be gained, medical treatment or a possible transfer. Despite his attempt to barter information for a different prison, he will most likely serve out his sentence in Colorado State Penitentiary. It's unlikely that he'll ever be known as the most prolific serial killer in America. His claim to fame is receding quickly.